Perfect. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us to our Reinstating Authorship and Human Agency in Translation. Today, we're going to be having a number of presenters talk about, instating human agency in a world that is more and more consumed by AI, and in the work that we do that is every day threatened by AI. It's good to have these conversations and see what we can do and how we feel about everything. So again, thank you very much for joining us. My name is Mariana Gonzalez. I am the president of the Translation and Interpreting Society at Hunter. And yeah, I just want to thank you all for coming and for keeping the beautiful art of translation alive. So first and foremost, we're going to have a presenter, Nick Bartlett, about the authority translation and the group unconscious and examining the role of cultural interpreter in China-based Tavistock conferences. So if you can please come up, thank you very much.
Morning, everybody. So I just want to start by saying thank you very much for having me here. I am not a professional translator or interpreter. I'm an anthropologist, and I have translated as part of a project in a sort of non-professional way, and that's part of the stakes of what I. Is this people can hear?
Do you mind holding the microphone? I think it's too far away.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the experience of translating in these conferences and what it might help us to think about more generally in terms of translation in the age of AI. There's a little bit of AI in this talk, but it's not AI focused. We were using simultaneous translation with AI translating like doing its own translation and putting it in subtitles, which would allow people to then challenge our interpretations with the machines, especially what we chose to leave out. So first, let me situate very briefly the group relations conferences, because they're strange, and it takes a minute to understand what they're about. So this tradition emerges in World War II in England, and it's institutionalized by the Tavistock Center, which is sort of the Tavistock Institute, which is okay. Which is a place where, like Anna Freud, a lot of psychoanalytic thinkers are grouped, and it moves out into it's providing trainings and doing other things, but it moves into the world to face publicly and try to transmit psychoanalytic understanding. So basically, the way a conference works, and these are the places where the translation is taking place, they recruit people from sort of open call, and between 3 days and actually the longest one is 2 weeks, but people get together, and in a series of events, the ones that I did were 3 or 4 days generally, you would live together, often in a hotel.
Yeah, good, yeah, okay.
And you would go through a series of sessions that they called here and now sessions. So if you're like basically here and now and then and there, and a here and now session is where the speech is indexical, and one can always position oneself like there's transference and there's a group understanding of transference. And according to this tradition, there's a group unconscious that is enacting and challenging and shaping the content that's emerging. And the point of the groups is a little bit like Seinfeld, like the point of the show about nothing, like the point of the groups is there is no point except to explore what's in the here and now of the group. And the purpose of that is then to try to understand the unconscious patterns that affect all groups. So so the translation aspect, it starts in the UK, it goes to the US, and then other countries in Europe and Latin America. And then when I'm getting involved was when it was arriving in China for the first time. And the first conference that was ever organized in China was in 2014. And they had encountered translation issues before, but this was a new challenge. And basically, there was a person who wanted to bring it to China was a psychiatrist at the University of Chicago who did not speak Chinese, had no history really in China, but emailed a lot of people, found some collaborators, and then they were going to throw this thing. All of the people who would operate the conference, who were senior, were non-Chinese speaking. There was one or two, actually, that's not quite true. There was one Taiwanese member who'd done a PhD in the US who was fully bilingual. Everybody else were non-Chinese speakers, and they were trying to figure out how to have Chinese psychologists and anybody who wanted to attend the conference to have the staff focused. To have a conference that could be sort of legible to predominantly Chinese speakers. And what they came up with was the director basically argued that he had been at a conference in Chicago where there had been professional translators who for sign language, and there'd been 3 of them who'd been assigned because it was long days. And he was adamant that there would not be professional translation, because he said translators, when they're in that function, are not part of the system. And they show up, they get paid at 9 to 5 or whatever the agreement was, 4 hours and then off 4 hours. And he said we need to have access to the translators, because in this working model, the translators are part of the system, and the system has an unconscious. So you need to access the translators. So he wanted translators who would be on staff rather than in a professional role. And he also rejected the notion of a professional translator, and he went instead with cultural interpreter. And cultural interpreters were recruited from people with psychological background in China who their remit was, you don't try to translate word for word. Trust yourself and your knowledge of Chinese culture and translate what is important for the conference. And you're authorized to not translate whatever you don't think is the essence of what and also interestingly, the function was not what was designed so that the translators were there, the cultural interpreters were there to interpret for the foreigners. And there was no translation for the Chinese. That wasn't the function of the stuff. So as you might imagine, a conference about the here and now, when translation was arranged in this way, was attacked And in fact, the cultural interpreters wrote and reflected on their experiences, and they talked about the danger of the projections that they were taking in as these like Chinese collaborators to like these foreign imperialists, whatever people who, and so basically it was very hard for them to sort of to endure the conference because they were constantly being attacked for basically for fulfilling their role as primarily aiding the foreigners to allow a Chinese conversation to happen. Um, so there was a second, so I'm going to talk about another 2 moments quickly, and then I'm going to talk about what this might mean for thinking about translation and interpretation more generally. The first conference that I went to in China was in 2018, and at this conference, they deliberately advertised it as bilingual, and they made the decision, the organizers made the decision to provide no translation. So we were in a room, it was, I want to say 50 native Chinese speakers, 3 native English speakers, and the staff still being predominantly non-Chinese speaking, and nobody was translating officially. And so members in the audience, some of whom were bilingual, were providing translations. And it became part of the conference about who would translate and when and why, and sort of for what purpose. And I remember a Chinese woman who had done her MA in the US, who was very bilingual, she was doing a lot of the early translation. And there was a silence when a consultant said something, and I translated it into Chinese so that the whole group could have access to it. And then the group spontaneously started applauding. And this Chinese woman who'd been translating was like, why are you applauding for the white guy? Like when he translates, like I've been doing this work the whole time and like being unrecognized for it. So there's a way in which the dynamics around the translation and what is being expressed on behalf of and then there's a dialogue where people, no, that's not like, anyway, but the point being that in the here and now at the conference, the exploration of language and who is in what language and how people are variously comfortable in languages and who authorizes whom through translation was explicitly made part of the conference itself in this sort of interesting kind of, I would argue, sort of radical way. And then the final conference I wanted to touch on briefly was we tried to design a conference where there wasn't a language preference. So where it was fully, so I was on the organizing committee for this conference. And again, each of them has about 50 people, 50 paying members who pay for the experience, and then 15 or 20 staff members, a lot of staff, in part because of the translation. So on this particular one, I was an administrator of the conference and I was on the translation team. And we weren't calling them cultural interpreters. I think we were just interpreters, but we were trying to do simultaneous translation for the entire conference, both English and Chinese in every single, and it was virtual because this was during COVID. So we were using Chinese Zoom, basically Zoomu, like these platforms. You can create all these rooms, and one of us 6 or 7 translators were in every single room throughout the time translating English and Chinese, and people were using the earplugs to listen so that they would just speak in their language, and we were trying to do simultaneous the entire time. And there were various challenges, but one challenge was that people were using AI to get their own translations that were appearing simultaneously, right? Because they can, it was subtitle and subtitle in the other language so that it came into yours. So there were moments where we were being challenged by people's reading of AI. I thought that person said this. And so it did authorize non-bilingual members to attack or at least challenge translators in new ways because they were doing this on their own. And that, of course, was also explored and interpreted. But the last thing about that whole setup was that it was very interesting how interpreters generally have taken a very marginal position in the staff. And that particular conference, the translation team, which was 2 Taiwanese people, 4 Chinese nationals, and me, we for some reason, we had a very powerful voice in the conference itself. So in the organizing meetings, the translators were jumping in and saying, well, I think we should do this. Like, no, that we don't have a big enough break. And we're sort of continually interrupting the function of the other people who were the consultants, who were generally, there's a status of different. So that's sort of the way that translation is made available to the group in making sense of itself as a group was part of the function of part of what these conferences were exploring. So I want to, in my remaining time, I wanted to think a little bit conceptually about what this does. And first of all, just to introduce, so I already mentioned here and now versus then and there. Are people familiar with psychoanalytically with the difference? Okay, so here and now is basically when you enter therapy, like psychodynamic therapy, so psychoanalytic tradition. So Freud and his people who came after him, you would believe that in everyday interactions, there's always transference, meaning we always see people through the history of other relationships we've had. You remind me consciously or unconsciously of my dad or whatever the thing is. This particular way of thinking about transference is when you go into and you're seeing a therapist, the start and the end of the session, that it starts at 9 and it ends at 9:50, allows for an exaggeration of the process of transference that we are constantly in, just not attending to. And a still skilled psychoanalyst or therapist is able to interpret what's going on that isn't conscious, that is repeating through relationships, which is why, the classic is why do we always choose partners who are bad for us? And over and over and over again, we know, but we do it. So it would be in the transference that those insights would become available. So the here and now and then and there of the conferences are trying to artificially divide what is live in the room in here and now, where language becomes indexical, and it's about who is uttering what and when. And then and there, where it's sort of about each individual is talking on behalf of themselves as an individuated being. And you sort of say, this is what I learned from that last session. This is my reflection. So something like being in it versus being sort of in a more rational or yeah, so sort of being in the midst of an emotional pull of transference and being somehow outside of it and trying to reflect on it. And of course, we can never fully be in either, but it's meant to be a mix. So three quick thoughts about translation in this context. One is the actually two. One is this woman, Anna Blundy, has a really interesting article that I came upon recently that talks about the interpreter as a maternal container. And she is writing about these Russian translators who are translating for Gorbachev and these other figures, like in US negotiations in the 1980s. And she argues that part of the function of translation is, and she uses, again, apologies, if you're not a psychoanalytic crowd, this is maybe not, but basically beta and alpha. So if in translation, part of what is happening is there's a digestion of anxiety and of other emotions. And in translating, it's not just the words, there's an emotional function, a maternal function, they argue, a little bit like infant and mother. This is the idea. Like an infant would be, and the metaphor is digestion. So the infant is trying to swallow something that they can't. They give it to the mother. I always think of birds, and the mother like helps them and then spits it back, and they're able to take it in. So she's arguing that the translator serves this function, and she has, and both for the person who's translating it, the person who says the thing, and on the other side. And she has these really interesting examples where she's exploring this in these very high-level negotiations that translators are doing. So I thought that idea of the psychic function of translation and knowledge actually requiring a digestion of unprocessed affective elements before people can take in the translation. So translators might be doing a lot more than is traditionally understood, like not just at the semantic level or whatever. And the second thing I wanted to talk about was a work by a psychoanalyst who is very controversial, who's really interesting. Her name is Avgi Stephanopoulos. She's a Cypriot analyst based here in New York. And she has an article that is exploring, basically, it's thinking about the limits of repair. And she's not talking about translation in particular, but I think it's really interesting and provocative what she's saying. So she's saying a certain model of, and here I'm going to apply it to translation, just a certain model of thinking about what the sort of the translator is providing would focus on repair. And sort of like we can think of like mourning, we can think of like how does one build back the bridges that have been. I feel like this is a very like the repair metaphor. There's like sort of and hermeneutics, so it's about understanding ultimately. She says that's a very popular model in psychoanalysis, and I would argue in translation. And she says it's not adequate to the moment. And she has been presenting on Palestine and getting banned from all these psychoanalytic conferences. So anyway, she has a certain like very radical activist streak where she's trying to think like, is repair adequate to the moment? And she says that hermeneutic understanding of the function of, and I'm going to apply it to translators, is inadequate to the time. And what she is interested in is, and she says, so there's the hermeneutic version, which is about creating understanding and bridging. And then there's the attachment version, like infant, mother, like we have this attachment and people who are well attached can move through the world in a certain way. And she's saying both of those, she wants something more radical. And so she says, actually, I want to go back to libido and the economic understanding of Freud. So libido being sexual energy. And she says that there's something about the translator as a person who has this reserve of unconscious energy that can go in different ways that she argues is much more dangerous and hard to predict. But also for her purposes, it's not about trying to make something the way it was before or to allow understanding for connection. It's about the potential of rupture and revolution. And so she thinks that this like sort of a libidinal understanding, like what would a libidinal understanding of translation look like? I think is sort of an intriguing idea. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Does anyone have any questions for Nick? No?
Thank you for your presentation, Nick. I'm wondering if translators or especially interpreters, if they're supposed to, I can see how they're supposed to digest affect. Are they supposed to transfer it as well? Do they have, and is that kind of transference, is it a professional obligation or is it a stylistic choice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that, so I like that this conference is about authorship, but I do think authority and authorship are very interlinked. And part of what the conferences emphasize, which I think is a very useful thing to always think about, is interpreters, like everybody else, are acting on a role, on a contract. And so part of the debates and the anger and the confusion are trying to figure out what the charge is. And there is no explicit, well, I mentioned that the cultural interpreters were explicitly told to serve the foreigners and to not translate anything, translate what they wanted to feel free to, and also to, sorry, I should add, to add the cultural elements that would make those interpretations legible to the foreigners. And so that becomes a work that actually gave them quite a bit of authority, even as it also subjected them to these really strong attacks, because understandably, like the Chinese members felt like you're these interpreters, but you're not helping us. You keep like turning away from us. So, and they were doing that in their role. So I would say that they did not have an answer to that question. And that became part, and that, remember this Tavistock system is trying to think about the group as a system. So they would then get very angry at, especially the director, for having set up this function in this way. But also, I think that in that last conference I mentioned where we were interpreters, we were sort of, I would say, like something like playing with the fact that we did have a lot of power in that conference. Like they really needed us. And I think we were more aware of that. And so we didn't put it in those terms, but I think we were sort of like flexing a little bit, like sort of and jumping in and feeling like we could say whatever we wanted to. Whereas, you know, if you think about the early ones, like the director, Jeffrey, when he was at that one in Chicago, the professional sign language translators didn't even attend any of the meetings. They were only there for the here and now sessions, and they were only in the function of doing the translation. So I think we did what he wanted, which was to bring us, the translators, into the system and have us participating like everybody else.
Anyone else? Any more questions for Nick? On the Zoom as well, anyone have a question? Oh, Sarah Elizabeth?
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your talk. It was so interesting. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
So I'm an interpreter, and your talk made me think of about a million questions, but the most recent one I'll mention is that the barriers to being able to like effectively communicate in the here and now, I find to be so numerous. I work in many different environments as an interpreter, and it's just interesting how often I've tried to do what you all did in that one conference where you used the word like we flexed a little bit and people kind of like realized how important it was. I've tried to, you know, insert myself a little bit in conferences or in the courtroom just to ask for documents, just or whatever I could do to be able to effectively like communicate in those situations. And I've just seen so many barriers to that. And I wonder if you had any thoughts about like how the culture of the interpreter or the translator, more the interpreter, I guess, because it's a more dynamic thing, could effectively kind of advocate or kind of push for that kind of effective flexing in the moment, just to be able to have a little bit more authority, because the word goes with authorship as well. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that. I've just seen so much resistance to it in my real life. So I was curious if you had any thoughts. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I remember I had this really vivid image of I was a different context, but I was in a public health world in China 20 years ago. And there was somebody who was translating for this medical doctor, and this person started doing more and more. And then I remember this medical doctor getting angry and saying, "You're just an interpreter. Just translate what I say and stop trying to take on this." So I think it does become sometimes it can become a battle of wills, I guess, which is part of what the conference is, I think, interested in drawing out. I mean, in terms of tips, like I think one thing that emerged was the translators, or whatever we're calling them, interpreters, who were better. Like even the last conference that we did was asymmetrical in the sense that each interpreter got to know the consultant that they were translating for, whether it was Chinese or English. They were a team who talked before the conference. But in the conference itself, they were supposed to equally serve those two. And I think that just being really open beforehand with that person about how they would work together allowed for there to be a lot like more unconventional ways that the person who was asking for the translation would say, "What do you think's happening?" You know, so they would begin to sort of be more reliant and really treat the interpreter or the translator as like a partner, which I think the translation team really appreciated because we did know a lot.
Thank you very much again, Nick. And next, we're going to be holding a talk about advocacy and translation, stories from courtrooms and prison cells. This is going to be held by Sebastian Muth and Professor Giulia Guarnieri. Thank you.
You have a lot of things. Did you just announce me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
All right. Trying to coordinate
Oh,
for the
sorry.
food to be delivered. You want that. It's important thing. All right.
Here we go.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, but I think first things first, just to make up for you know, a little bit of a kind of jumbled schedule here. I owe you all an official welcome as the director of the master's program in translation and interpreting, and as well as a lecturer with the Department of Classics. Also, we need to have all the thank yous, right? This is important. So good morning and a hearty welcome. Thank you for showing up. You know, we are in these odd times, right? You know, first people who show up physically here, sitting here is amazing. I'm very moved. And also people who, you know, who are out there in our cyberspace where we're flooded, inundated with thousands, millions, practically of stimuli of all kinds. So it takes choice, right? And I think today we find ourselves making this choice to do what we do here. I want to thank the CUNY Research Foundation for their support. This is the first time we've gotten this, and this is the 6th year that we're doing this as part of the program's events. and Hunter College, the School of Arts and Sciences, and without them, we wouldn't have the lunch today, or this new banner, which, like I said, would be your photo op later. And yes, we're here to, and without much ado, we will start with our topic here with Sebastian Muth, who's supposed to be here. Unfortunately, he's not feeling too well. So he's still stuck in Germany. Too bad for him, right? Who missed the sandwiches, right, Sebastian? So, okay, here we go. Advocacy and translation, stories from courtrooms and prison houses. So first of all, right, just to frame this topic, why advocacy and why at this time? I think, yes, indeed, in any of these conventions, convergence of those of us who are in the trade, in the craft, we're constantly thinking about translation, what it's all about, right? And for the purpose of today's discussion, it includes interpreting. But we also note that we have one speaker, Nick, right? Nick, yes, his first disclaimer in coming up here is to say, oh, I'm not a translator, I'm an anthropologist. But why can't we be both? We have so limited this notion of translation, and that is, to me, the root of the crisis that we're in, right? So, I would say that basically it's about making sense, right? And to be human is to translate. Wow, pretty radical, right? Because I'm sure we think of translation in terms of languages. So how would you translate if you only speak one language, which we are in this space, of classic linguistic hegemony. If any place is more hegemonically, Anglophone, here we are, right? Yeah. I'm saying this because that's what it is. Translation is about the resistance to a single story. The author, Chimamanda, the Nigerian author, she's a translator by birth, practically, right? And her work is translation. Her writing is translation. Her authority, her voice, her authorship, all of it is translation. She may be speaking only in English, as the moment requires, or not, right? Or in 2 or 3 different languages as part of her multilingual repertoire. Whatever it is, that's what it is. Translation is about making sense. It's about re-saying things. It's about puzzling over stuff. These are the things that only we humans can do. And therefore, we should start on that note, that there's not much we want to worry about unless we choose to limit ourselves to the other version of translation, which actually relates to, that was a great question. Was it Elizabeth who posed the question? Right? The question just now, and that, how it is that, we want to do this, but we can't, because it's kind of awkward, like we are overstepping, because we have drawn a little, box around where we're supposed to stand, when we're doing the work, whether it be interpreting or translation, right? So that's where, we're framing this, right? And the advocacy is about, okay, yes, that's what we do because that's what we're expected. That's how we are understood and recognized. And that's how we've been getting paid. But now that we're even under threat, we may not get paid for being so good and compliant to the monolinguals. Therefore, what are you going to do next? Right. So in that sense, it kind of is a grim topic. Sebastian would say, well, based on his data, right, that translation is for the privileged class only. That most people and their stuff will never get translated, right? Because there's no audience for it. And he's, bringing us that kind of gutsy stuff, right, today. And we're both right. The human impulse is to clarify, to understand, to learn something new, to do it for ourselves and for others, right? And, to go for the friction. The friction is important. Right? AI wants everything smooth, and that's what kills us. Then, with globalization, with the way, we have learned to monetize what we do, right? Translation goes to market, therefore it becomes a value commodity, and only some people can afford it, right? And AI comes along to make sure that fewer people can afford it. So either way, the translator interpreter is a natural advocate for themselves. The imperative is to construct meaning for yourself and for others, to give voice, to make known things that are otherwise unseen or unhearable, because the translator or the interpreter cares.
So, okay, thank you, Julie. So, hi everyone.
Yes.
Yeah, it's actually my slide, right? So, thank you, Julie, for this wonderful introduction, also for this wonderful invitation to come along. And I'm really sorry, I was absolutely not well when I was supposed to travel. So, but I appreciate the opportunity to come along. So, so a bit of context. I work at Lancaster University in the UK. So it's maybe a bit of a slightly different context from the US. I wanted to kind of add a bit to Julie's data and also show how kind of how it actually looks like when no one cares basically what you say or what you're going to say, or actually would be kind of detrimental to the goals of your own place, your own institution, if someone would actually have something to say. And also maybe in the end think a bit about how AI could play a role in all of this. So the research that I was doing concerned England and Wales basically, and specifically how prisons that are administered by what's really called His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, how they manage multilingualism. There are quite a few prisoners in the UK who are classified as FNO prisoners, foreign national offenders. So this is around 12% of the whole prison population. The UK, or specifically England, has a rather high rate of incarceration if you compare it to the whole population. In Europe, this is only really comparable to Russia. The largest groups of basically people who are supposed, or who are often viewed as not speaking English well enough to understand prison procedures, rules, obligations, all that kind of stuff, or access training, are Albanians, Romanians, Polish, Poles, Lithuanians, Pakistani, but we actually don't know much. There's, of course, an unclear legal obligation to accommodate them. So the UK is bound by UN standard minimum rules for treatment of prisoners, but this is often not really the case. When it comes to interpreting, you're basically pretty much, and I'll show this a bit in data in a second, at the mercy of who are you facing in terms of which prison guard is kind of is talking to you. They have the option to contact the big word remotely through a contract that is running through the court system in the UK. Okay, but more bit on this later. Julie will now talk a bit about her data.
Thanks, Sebastian. So my research is based in Toronto. I have spent some years following a group of what came down to be 8. I started out with 11 individuals, and they're aged around 30 to 50 years old, tracked their lives. Mostly this because of COVID, this went online with us. However, as myself, a practicing interpreter and lifelong translator, I could picture most of the concrete aspects of what they do. And so this is a coherent group. It's not a random human sampling. These people, I'm sure you identify with them, and you're probably curious about what draws these people to end up doing this work. And some of it will come out in my direct quotations of which is the data. So they're Canadian immigrants from China, all but one from Taiwan, and they've spent over 5 years in Canada, in Toronto. They all are identified as ethnic Chinese, and they declare Mandarin or Fuzhou or Cantonese as their first language, native or mother tongue. They all have advanced proficiency, obviously, an active use of English for everyday work purposes, right? Which is what makes it possible for them to work as interpreters and translators, and all on a freelance basis. They work with institutions, except for one who ended up getting a full-time gig, the first and only historically in Canada as an interpreter, full-time interpreter for the criminal court. So the usual, right? The textbook domains of healthcare, legal, and social services, that they work in. They're recruited also organically, right? Which actually reflects how the fact of my out there, kind of to me, then this is also my sourcing my material. Right. So as a translator, as a researcher, I'm at the same time doing translational research, right? And that I'm sourcing this material. And how do I source this? I source this, by putting myself out there and being part of, the relationship, the building that is needed in our work life as well as in the social life. And so the group then over these years actually has through the research, right? What they gain and is also a little kind of a hub of a like a very specialized resource. It's a group of people that actually critically talk about interpreting and translation work. And I hope that maybe that could suggest to you a model for yourself going forward as a support system. I think yeah, you're next.
Okay, here we are.
Sorry, yeah, because
can you see? Can you see all right?
Yeah, yes, okay. I can see the slide, but I can't see what's the next slide. Yeah.
Okay, me neither actually.
Okay.
So my data is a bit from a very different field and from kind of the other way around. So it's about the humans behind bars, so with little audience and little agency, or So what I did is I visited 4 adult male prisons run by His Majesty's Prison Service through different categories, so to get a kind of a good view to see at what kind of different language issues emerge at different stages of people's incarceration. And of course, you already have to there are drawbacks in a way. Also, you're in a way doing research in such a space always requires kind of you're not completely on your own, and there are also other people with certain interests involved. So in this case here, there were several kind of stakeholders involved, and basically what I was allowed to is to go along their own pretty much non-consequential inspection visits, and I was then able to arrange follow-up visits for myself in prison with people I found maybe interesting and relevant. Also interesting, what I didn't anticipate, there was quite on the ground level among managers and prison low-level managers quite a willingness to actually, or at least hear about language issues. So it's more built in the system that it becomes an issue higher up, basically. And then it's an issue of awareness, but we'll see this later on. So what I did, I focused on key sites that really matter, was where language matters, so induction. So when you get told what's going on in prison, when there is a meeting that, okay, this is the prison routine, this is the regimen that we are following, this is when certain things are happening, this is how you complain, this is how you get new clothes, this is how you access training, this is how you maybe access legal help, all those kind of things, library, internet, phoning relatives, family, and so on. so those kind of different moments, and also reception, so when you actually enter the prison. Again, the drawback was you can't choose yourself which place you go. So there's always a bit of dependency on what your stakeholders actually are visiting at the moment, what kind of prison staff is actually available. Prisons in England and Wales are quite understaffed. And then also you might end up maybe, with maybe quite uninteresting data initially, because you end up in a prison where there are no people who speak another language. So the problem, maybe I'm kind of to identify the problem, and I'm coming more from a linguistics, applied linguistics background, but also qualitative, actually most of the time. You can see those problems that surface around kind of being not heard and being not catered for, not being interpreted in a way is quite known, at least in the UK. So that there are good mechanisms in place to at least highlight that there are problems and just kind of showcase some of them. If you Google kind of prison inspection reports, or if you Google UK prison probation ombudsman, if you Google His Majesty's Prison Inspectorate, or you'll find individual reports for each prison, and sometimes, not always, translation or language issues as such come up. But given the kind of, not complexity, but given the bad state of the penal system in the UK as a whole, and how underfunded it is, and how much it reflects class differences and all this stuff, this is one issue that often kind of gets sidelined pretty much. And here's just kind of two examples. One highlights in the inspection report that someone was found hanging in his cell, and basically the inspection concluded that this was also part because no one cared, no one bothered to actually ask him how he was doing, and no one bothered to actually organize interpreting services to assess his mental health. So now I go a bit into my own data. This is field note data, and first of all, step one, of course, does the institution care, and then how do those translation issues emerge in the first place? So and this is basically just put from my field notes. This is in the reception area, so the place where you enter the prison for the first time when you come from the courthouse or when you get transferred from another prison. This is in the Greater London area. And then I'm basically doing, kind of not posing as obviously a prisoner, but I say, okay, look, now I'm a guy who doesn't know English very well, so how does it go? So basically, so I've just arrived and no clue what's going on, no English, what do you do? And then I'll describe basically what she's doing. So she took a folder from a closet, she opens it, and then you have kind of very basic stuff. So hand-drawn image, the baby, okay, a birthday cake, and a question mark, okay, when's your birthday? And you write it down, and she puts it into a form. And then she came up with various kind of random stuff from a folder. And then I just say, but in a very nice way. So this is not an inspection visit, like, no, when do you ever pull this out? No. So basically, it's often very much that you wing it most of the time. This is of course, not necessarily representative of most places, but actually, at the time of research, you could, like, if we talk to stakeholders, it pretty much reflects what is going on more widely. When you then move on to research in prison, and when you, for instance, then do, and this was a focus group we did with prison guards, like who work on different wings, and this prison was near Liverpool. And it was a kind of, I remember like around 7-8% of people who they suspected were not speaking English to a level that they would effectively understand what's going on around them. And then we basically, in this focus group, we kind of, me and a colleague, we kind of casually talk about, like ask, okay, how what's going on with people who don't know English? So it's very much an entry-level question. So, and then they say, okay, they don't cause trouble, right? Because they're the quiet ones. And then two officers say, yeah, we have Romanian lads, Albanians, Vietnamese, Poles. And then we ask, like, how do you talk with them? Like, and they said, Google, right? And then everyone else basically confirms that, which is something that is happening now and will happen. I think that Google will be now replaced by AI and handheld devices anyway. Another thing also, when kind of that highlights also how convenient it is, or how it really doesn't matter in the eyes of the institution, as for instance, what Officer 3 shares. So 2 Vietnamese lads who were in this prison for 2 weeks and very reclusive, they didn't communicate. So she says that at some point, one of them came to the wing officer who was a drawing the team to ask how about to use the phone when there's dinner time. So dinner time basically means at some point you collect just a tray of stuff and you take it to your cell and then you can eat it whenever you want. And Officer 2 says, how are we supposed to know? The lads didn't understand the thing. So they didn't know what's going on for 2 weeks, basically. So in Officer 3 remarks, they're usually the quiet ones. You don't know when they're in trouble because they don't cause any trouble initially. And finally, they also have consequences, of course. So this is in a peer prisoner focus group in one prison in the west of England that was a high security prison. And this is frankly something that quite often also happens because of staff frustration, again, of being not understood, not having any mechanisms in place to initially kind of find out what languages people actually speak. So ESOL screening, whatever it is. So yeah, prisoner A, this is again a focus group, but this time with peer prisoners. Peer prisoners are prisoners who were supposed to help others, kind of to navigate the place a bit. Some prisoners have this in place, some don't, and sometimes they happen to be multilingual. In this case, someone was also involved here and told a bit about this case. So he brought up the case that everyone confirmed. It happened some weeks ago. So Romanian who didn't understand the orders of the guards to go to his cell got badly beaten up and then restrained. So one guy in the group, the Caribbean background, says, yeah, they knew that he didn't speak English, had no idea of the rules. Why did they do this? And of course, this then also leads to complete breakdown of trust in the place. Anyway, so sometimes does have consequences in the end that you don't talk. Over to Julie again.
Okay, that's great, right? A load of stuff. So I won't keep people too long from their lunch. I realized, and of course, naturally, we're running late, so bear with us. And we also started late. So I asked my interpreters, right, just as, Sebastian asked, so, how does translation emerge from this data, right? So how do translation jobs come to you? Was the question that I asked in my research. What are the problems out there that would call for your translation, right? So just now we have a Sebastian with his subheading as what was that? No English, no talk, no problem, right? No talk, no problem. So one of my informants actually had a parallel, and hers was no English, no talk, right? So her position was it's very simple. She said, if I don't talk, nobody talks. Right? Because that's what it is. So nobody's allowed to talk. If you talk in another language, you're not hearable in any situation. And of course, right, a lot of interpreters end up of having to because they're interested in getting it done with as little friction or problems as possible, and getting out of there and moving on to the next job, which you understand, so that this job is done with no complaints, maybe high ratings. Nowadays if you do the ratings, and then you invoice and get paid. And so they I think the culture is to discipline the client, right? Only speak in your native language, right? Don't mix up anything, even if it's maybe more natural for you because you've been in the US quite a while, and and your talk is a way of kind of navigating and using certain vocabulary in English. No, that's not allowed, right? So that actually cramps the poor guy, and so the poor guy doesn't speak as much as they might want to. So that simplifies the the interpreting event. So when I ask this question, the thing that comes to me is that the conversation pivots to institutions, to pay rates, different languages and dialects that tack to different demands, and the demand supply game in the market. So it's market world talk, right? And really, it's very hard to have interpreters get in the habit of learning to talk about the work process, like the process, like how is this whole thing, what is happening, right? How did it even become a problem? Well, how did something become a problem so that problem is then identified as a need, and that need then becomes a project, and that project is framed in such a way and entered in such a way that so it is allocated to you as an assignment, So and then the same goes for written translation. That whole thing, right? That is the real problem. The real problem is we don't know how problems are identified or framed or noticed or ignored. We take for granted they just drop from the sky, right? And then we lose no time in saying, yes, I accept, I'm available, because we depend on it for a living. So we have kind of been complicit in this whole system that makes it so easy for AI. Yay! It's like getting the rats out, because you leave the cake. So between the need and the demand and the product, what I envisioned then, what I ended up having to grapple with from the data is this thick, dark tunnel. What exactly is the process that we call the language service industry, right? So that's a question, right? I think that we want to kind of get into the habit of thinking about. So translate interpreters, and some of you heard me say this, in class, they're like mushrooms, right? You fed a lot of shit and you kept it a dog, right? So we start and we stay at this end of the tunnel, right? Shrinking the problem to pure linguistics. So when we talk, we spend a lot of time, right? Improving our language, studying our vocabulary, right? Because that's the fun part. That's the part that animates us. I don't blame you. I love it, right? But then the rest of it, what are we going to do, right? So here's Clara, right? Oh, here I have the Ontario one. What do we call it? The Ontario Accredited Community Interpreter. Who issued that one? Oh, wait, let me think. And she's kind of scrolling over the phone. I don't know if you're familiar with this, right? A credential-obsessed interpreter or translator, who carries, all the credentials on her phone so that she could quickly, see her qualification and she could accept or decline, as she goes. Sometimes she may have to enter buildings where have to show her credentials. So, so that, to me, that mindset really captures, right, where we're at and how we're trapped in market world language services rather than translation and interpreting. So, going to work for us, right, and this is something that came from the data, it's like having to learn a whole new mode of non-communication. Translation interpreting as framed by market world as language services is not communicative. Don't kid yourself. What is communicative is the before and the after, and all the stuff that you do, including what we do here, but not when you're actually translating, interpreting for billable affairs, right? So you have Chu, for example, right? Or, we can't just speak in our own personal style. You cannot have side conversations. That's what we learned. That's the difference between us. We're the professionals, not like these bilinguals who mess things up, right? And then of course you forgot that just a year ago she was a regular bilingual helping her neighbor, right? So we numb those skills so that we take up this other mode that is, as I said, non-communication. Clara, she says, when I interpret, my voice is like not my voice. My voice, I consider myself like a machine that delivers the messages in both directions. I prefer to mimic the source voice. And she's so pleased with that. And yeah, it's great because when you can do that, first of all, that's what is required, to work as a simultaneous interpreter. Otherwise, you'll be exhausted. So and then here's Henry, right? Whenever I come across a word I don't know, I take it down. Every day I work on my word and my phrases. Every morning I read out loud. And I know, from elsewhere, it's about 800 words. Each passage he makes himself read in Chinese and in English. right, different passages, so that he can automatize and he can become, more efficient and speedy in his work. And then Ivan, they say I have a natural smiling face, so I always try to look at the distance so I don't engage with the client. All right, again, right? No English, no talk. I guess Danella tells me that we should conclude. So if we should maybe move forward to some of the conclusions. Okay, here it is. Yeah. So, basically, what are we advocating, right? So I think what comes out of our data, is that, it calls attention to how, as translators and interpreters, we have two realms of existence, okay, that you kind of need to reconcile and grapple with, right? One realm is working in language services, where, you feel like you have to maintain strict linguistic boundaries, that you act like monolinguals, even though you're not, right? And, you spend maybe, if you're thriving, busy, professional, you spend most of your time in the third person mode, right? Especially if you're interpreting, you're not really speaking for yourself, right? And your content, the stuff, what comes out of my data too is that, like Sebastian and I, we are here. I mean, he has such rich data because he's thinking and working translationally, but not actually doing translation services. So it's how do you get out of the service mode? Of course, you got to be in the service mode to make money, but maybe, make money the off-centered thing, off-center money, right? And recenter subjectivity. Don't be afraid to be wrong, right? Don't be afraid that your product is imperfect, because the beauty of it is the imperfection. The beauty of it, ultimately, what we save in ourselves from AI, stuff that AI and nobody else can steal from you, or AI could steal from you, is the pleasure, the process, the power of, the cognitive work that we do. Right. So, I think that, staying away from the obsession with neutrality, right? All that, sure, you do that. I do that too, right? And, thinking, oh, yes, I bridge culture because I know how to say it this way, therefore, oh, the idioms, that's what represents the culture, It's all nonsense. Culture is what unsettles you. Culture is when you dwell in the, in the in-between and you can't decide and you slip over and the next day you come up with a different solution. That's culture. That's the kind of stuff that AI cannot take from us. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. Sebastian, any final words?
You're totally over time, I guess. Thank you very much.
No, say something. Say something.
I want to keep everyone from lunch in a way. So when I kind of what I've heard, for instance, and this is also interesting to see about AI and how AI also kind of looms large around prisons, and in the UK is basically the ways it is often now framed in trials as something that kind of is better than the human, because it's kinder than the prison guard, right? It doesn't talk back. It doesn't give you kind of doesn't get funny with you. And interestingly, the other way around, when we asked, for instance, prison guards who at some point needed maybe to set up a big word conversation, book one in advance, because they needed it, they were legally required to do it. They often said, okay, or sometimes said, okay, the interpreter got funny with me somehow, and then the interpreter actually talked back, which was very weird, and that they found weird, and they would always kind of argue in the end.
You see the irony of this.
It's doom. It's your doom, right? I don't want to. You're not, of course, but it's super ironic, right?
Actually, yeah, I can't help but think of poor Adam Rain, was his name, who killed himself in November, 16-year-old kid, because chatbot agreed with him all the way, right? How sick is this? Anyway, okay. Any questions, guys? Yes.
Okay. Hi, Sebastian. This question is for you. My name is Leonel Bahanya. I'm a semi-retired court interpreter from New York City. And I'm always interested in finding out how court systems provide language access, interpreters, translation services. Here in the United States, in New York at least, interpreters are involved in pretty much the whole process, whether you're in civil court, family court, to criminal courts. We are there for the victims, we're there for the plaintiffs, we're there for the accused. In England, excuse my ignorance in the British legal system, but in England, who provides the interpreters in the court? Is it in the court itself when the person goes in front of the judge? Is it the barrister, the court system? Do they have the oral tradition that we have here in the United States?
It's called the Crown Prosecution Service, who would do it in the courts, but I've not done research in the courts. I've specifically only focused on prisons, but in the courts, it's pretty much there wouldn't be the same situation in prison. So you definitely would get an interpreter if you're not understood well enough, or if you feel you need one, you get one from it's called the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, who do this in England specifically.
Thank you.
Was it this what you meant, or?
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Time for one more. Anyone online? Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tay and Mr. Sebastian Muth. All right, cool. So the next one is 2 case studies in literary translation. It's by Giulia Guarnieri. Trubikhina, thank you. So it is finding the language of political agency, translating anti-war Russophone poetry after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So everyone please give it up for Giulia Guarnieri.
You can pronounce my name.
I apologize. Oh, there's another presenter? I thought there was just only one. There's only one. I think is it? Right, yes. Oh. And Giulia Guarnieri? Yes. All right, cool.
Okay, so I guess my presentation has to do with something that is much harder to do with AI. I do believe that AI will replace us as interpreters in practical matters. It's already doing it, but it will be harder to do in literary translation. It's widely used. I use it myself, but you have to edit. But it's almost no help so far in a poetry translation. It creates pretty inane poetry, syntactically, structurally solid, but completely inane. We'll see in 5 years. But my paper has to do with specifically literary translation as a form of resistance, and more specifically, translation of poetry as Russian or Russophone, as it is now called, poetry, as a mode of resistance. You probably are aware of what is happening, right, with the war of Russia against Ukraine. And so since I do not translate from Ukrainian, I translate from Russian, I did for the last 2 years, basically. This is what I've been focusing on. With an exception of translating a novel, but that was for money. It was a good novel, a decent novel. So I did, as a preliminary word, I've been speaking about it as it progressed in several venues. I did a 3-hour talk in Russian for the Russian program at Middlebury College, where I had a chance, because it was so long, we did the interruptions, breaks. I spoke not only of the anti-war poetry, but Russophone anti-war poetry, but also about an extremely interesting thing also to study as propaganda, the so-called Z poetry. So I have to say just very briefly something about it, because otherwise one of my cases would be not clear as I talk about it. So after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, in the ever-tightening situation with police situation within Russia, it's now the jail for poetry. We have some very famous cases with a lot of political violence, and it's been worsening in the last couple of months with political prisoners being found dead in jail, for example, or in detention. So at the same time, as it always happens, there is the other side within Russia, which is sort of a revanche of the poets who were not, in most cases, there are a couple of writers who before the war were pretty decently successful. But as the censorship increased, this is the so-called Z poetry, which is a jingoistic propaganda, pro-Putin, pro-war poetry. Incredibly interesting case of study because it's propaganda. It's like studying Nazi propaganda, for example, Nazi visual and literary propaganda. So why Z is because the letter Z was used, and there are different explanations for that, as a distinguishing marker as Russian armored vehicle rolled into Ukraine. So like to distinguish themselves from the opponents. And so that now became sort of and Z it's a Latin letter in Latin alphabet, not in Russian, which is very bizarre. However, this is what it is. It's a so-called Z poetry. They have their own Telegram channels. They had, until the money now is running out, they had some investment of the regime and so on. So basically, I'll have a very brief introduction and then just show you and talk about specific cases. I would say that, and I'm here using a phrase of a very famous Russian literary critic who is now in the United States, thinking in the presence of war has become a stable feature in the consciousness of contemporary Russian Russophone poets. We are aware, of course, of the so-called relocation. It's similar to emigration, because in droves, like comparable to the emigration after the Russian Revolution in the early 20th century, the intellectual elite, and not only elite, those who were threatened by mobilization, by draft, essentially, to have to go to the war, fled Russia, especially in waves, early in February 2022, then during the first mobilization, meaning the first drafting wave, and now we are witnessing the second, because the conditions within Russia are worsening economically also. It's not necessarily all, intellectual elite. A lot of young men who can be drafted also relocated. It's hard to assess the numbers because those who did not relocate and relocation because they don't have documents. It's extremely hard to obtain visas or temporary status. So near and far abroad, the hardest is the United States, obviously. They are scattered. But this is not only intellectuals. There are those who are afraid of the draft and don't want to be sent to war to die there. They essentially, in those waves, it's hard to assess the numbers, though there were some assessments, especially in the first year, and like 800,000 people by some assessment. But some of them went back when the mobilization subsided and they can't find jobs and they are unsettled there and so on. Not the political one, not the political relocation. That turns into immigration if the people can obtain documents. So now specifics. So I thought I'll show you that the three, maybe four cases, I rethought of my idea of talking about the cases of one case. Maybe I'll just tell generally because it's difficult poetry. So I wanted to show several examples of very different poets that are also located in different places. You can guess that in the state with strong political repressions, the obvious difference will be also where a poet is physically. So located, it's more dangerous to be more explicit once you are in a fascist country, right? But it's not necessarily the case. That's why my major case, because it's usually fun to show, is the poet called German Lukomnikov, who is a friend of mine and a very popular poet, and he is in Russia. He is sort of what the critic Ilya Kukulin called an example of practice of poetical Parrhesia. Parrhesia means candid speech, basically speaking freely, not only implying freedom of speech, but basically the obligation to speak the truth. His anti-war poetry, absolutely, because the whole system is random, though less random recently. So nobody could understand how he could be published in 2022 in one of the normal, regular magazine called Volga. And it's striking because it's very openly anti-war, and his anti-war is striking because it's published in Russia. So he was born in 1962. He's a poet who is unique because of his image. You'll sort of see in the visuals, he is a bearded man with a worn-out sweater, with long, disheveled hair, and he sort of is in the image and conducts himself in the image of a holy fool, which is a well-venerated figure in Russian culture, right? Who is sort of like a parallel to a jester in British poetry and British theater. Like a buffoon. So he actually played a holy fool in the production of Dmitry Krymov, who is a very famous theater director, now stationed, also relocated in New York. And we just recently had his production of Uncle Vanya in La Mama. It was extremely popular. He's one of the most known Russian directors. So he's, year before the war, he had a very innovative production of Boris, and it's based loosely on Pushkin, Boris Godunov, and Lukomnikov played in this production a holy fool, a character in Boris Godunov. So he's also known by a varied set of literary identities and voices. He is an heir to avant-garde tradition. He evolved as a minimalist poet, even though some dub him conceptualist. I don't agree with this. He also is a prominent representative of the so-called poetry of combinatorial literary restrictions, which is like anagrams, palindromes, acrostics, figure poems, drawing poems. He has been a slam champion in Europe, a master of audio, visual, and performative poetics. And finally, he is one of the beloved children's poets, the best kind, that is not only for children. I know this firsthand from my indirect association with the artistic collective called Special Artists, made of individuals with special needs, different forms of autism, Down syndrome, and other people with this kind of disabilities. My own half-sister in Moscow, a talented artist and ceramist, is among them. Such individuals often have a characteristic profile of language and communication strengths and difficulties, and Lukomnikov's poetry, as well as, for example, poetry of the last wave of Russian avant-garde that Stalin physically annihilated in the late 30s during the Great Terror, speaks to the condition of such people, so to speak. His cooperation with the collective Special Artists and its founder, Veronika Pavlenko, has been a long-term and very fruitful. So, as illustrations, I would show you some of their creation, a creation of Veronika Pavlenko. She created a series of silk scarves, sort of batik scarves, like sort of tie and dye, sort of Turkish style, hand printing on fabric with wax and dye. And the individual sections or squares of these beautiful creations were illustrations of individual anti-war poems of Lukovnikov and with the text. And I wanted to have such scarf, but they were sold practically immediately. So tell me, can you see if I... No, I don't think it works. Oh, 3 times. Okay. Maybe you can eliminate others. So as you know, okay.
Oh, wait. That's
For number 1. No, not this.
This one?
Okay, this one. So this you can see Lukovnikov, right? And the bomb. Lukovnikov, as I said, is a disheveled guy with a beard and a stretched sweater, and the Russian text. And I'll read the English because we, in fact, nobody, I assume, here speaks Russian. These are my translations. It is I, German Lukovnikov, who could not stop the mad colonels. My lines of poetry saved no one's son, no one's daughter. Here should be a continuation of some kind, but nothing appropriate comes to mind. It's very hard to translate this kind of poetry. Huh? Ooh, I didn't blend this well. I'll show a couple of more examples. Let's show 2. We started late, that's why I'm kind of thrown. So this is another example. I can show, yeah.
You can just click the arrows.
The arrows. So you can see multiple faces, right? Nothing was asked of us. No one asked for our opinion. No one forgave us. We are from Russia. So it's an incredibly interesting, very simple poetry that both takes responsibility, personal responsibility for what's happening, and is speaking freely. So let me just show you one more example. I don't know how to do it. I won't do it, and you can ask me later. So I'll show you another example. I'll show you other examples, just show. As you can see, the state needs... Okay. The state must be fed. Forward march. Let's be dead. It's essentially meat grinder, right? Like this is. We have noticed, of course, something bad was up. So why didn't you speak up? It's a dialogue of 2 women drinking tea with tanks rolling by, right? It just has never come up. Exactly. I'll choose. This is about the interaction with other Russians that suddenly became very dangerous. Even people you know. I ran into a good friend, but he's up to no good and not friendly. This is you know how people can write online about something that, like, Ukrainians basically screaming so often to their relatives in Russia, like, they're bombing you. Russia is bombing us. And the Russian relatives would be like, a hard peace, right? So this is the commentary. I'm off to the execution. Drive safely. And this is, of course, a comment on the famous propaganda poster of the time of, I'll finish, World War II, and with basically saying, repeating the words, arise great nations, arise to fight to the death against the dark fascist force. So far is the same, right, as was the propaganda song, with your fucking self, of course. So I guess that's it. I won't be able to tell you about other poets, but I'll finish with the conclusion, okay? So to reject post-war principles of universal humanism and conversely to resist the discourse of violence means developing new scripts for emotional life and interpersonal communication. Such scripts were either absent in post-Soviet culture or remained within the purview of small numbers of political or artistic activists. Today, these scripts are being intensively worked out in the sphere of poetry. And if poetry had been for the early aughties, the first decade of the aughties, is concerned either with rejecting the subject altogether or looking for a lyrical subject, probably the most important is finding political subjectivity, because it allows you to linking personal narrative of trauma. And you see the Russians are in a strange position. You can't not feel trauma. You are also part of the trauma, but you have no right to feel it because the real victims are Ukrainians. And so this is a way of creating agency and connecting the personal trauma with a wider historical context. Those who want more poetry of this kind, I'll show you. It's sort of not enough time. It's bigger. I have to.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh,
Look at your
Mhm.
Okay, Miss Giulia next. Yes. You can start. I'm just gonna finish
Yeah,
getting
no
this
problem. I
out.
don't have any
Okay, no problem.
feature stuff.
You can start, LWC6.
Okay, hi. I was asked to a little bit modify the talk to make it more cohesive. So I did translators. We all study translation. So translating obviously from one language to another, it's can be rather problematic, and then particularly for Italian, but that I'm going to talk about where at times it could be rather challenging. During my academic experience, I developed a strategy experience in the battlefield that is particularly useful. And to make this evident, I analyzed and studied for many years Italo Calvino, who is a prominent 20th century Italian writer narrative. Primarily in this talk, I will focus on the social role of translation, the role of AI, the translation of gender and cultural words, and finally, Calvino's use of the Italian language, which is a very useful tool in evaluating the existing English translations and how to possibly generate new ones. I will also focus on underlining a significant aspect when considering the social and intellectual benefits of translation as an academic exercise, particularly at a moment when AI tools are already highly effective at producing fluent translation for every day. And I want to say the words that Julie said before, right? We want to create a friction when we translate, when we study the translations, and we don't want to use AI that produces this kind of smooth translation as using Julie's words. These technologies serve the needs of the consumer, and they're highly accurate. They have a high element of accuracy, but we're going to see how problematic they are when they translate cultural terms, and how important it is for the translator to make choices and address some of these issues that they create. Translation, as we all know, is not merely a technical skill that converts words from one language to another. It's a deeply cultural and social act that requires us to negotiate meaning across contexts, audiences, and perspectives. A human translator makes choices about tone, register, ambiguity, and cultural nuance that reflects an understanding of both languages and the communities that use them. And this is exactly what I will attempt to show you today with my talk and my research, that translations are not merely coming up with the right answer or equivalence, is above all an act of literary creation. The versatility and polyvalence expressed in Calvino text are highly connected with their ability to navigate the social and historical context in which they were written, something that AI is not always able to grasp. At the beginning of my study of his translations, I underlined Calvino's cultural background so that I could grasp the specificity of Calvino poetics. And in particular, I focused my attention on certain aspects that, from a linguistic point of view, appear to be most problematic. For example, Calvino's tendency to use allegory, metaphors, and the fairy tale register as a literary mean to mirror the illness of contemporary society, and in addition, as a principle of rationalization and criteria of order, which underlines even more the challenges any translators would face. I quickly realized that the knowledge of Calvino poetics, his personality and personal life was particularly useful because it allowed us translators to develop the necessary sensitivity to remain faithful to the translation of his work. In my experience, I find that this plurality of thematic, stylistic, semantic, and lexical levels create no small challenges for the translator of Calvino's text. As one of his main translators, William Weaver, states, ciò che si perde non è il senso, ma la poesia. What you lose is not the meaning, but poetry. I had the privilege of interviewing him many times. Moreover, it is often essential to incorporate theoretical and conceptual tools along with useful methodologies when approaching his text. I, of course, rely when I study his translations on, the theoreticians very well known that you all know, Peter Newmark, Eugene Nida, Lawrence Venuti, each of whom concentrate on a particular aspect of the translation process. Newmark produces a methodological systematization of the translation activity, and to achieve this task, he creates a series of practical and conceptual categories, like, for example, the definition of over and under translation, a rather pertinent tool in translating Calvino. Nida, on the other hand, is interested in the methodological aspect and describes in a rather practical manner the grammatical, syntactical, and lexical categories of the text. More recently, David Wood breaks down the component of formulaic language, like discourse structure and word sequencing. George Yule, in his work, The Study of Language, analyzes each element of speech, especially gender in language and culture, providing insights into the process and choices of future translations. Venuti privileges, among other things, the ethical aspect linked to the faithfulness of a translation. Thus, the so-called equivalence effect is an aspect that comes from the critical and hermeneutical activity that assigns a creative role to the translator. According to Venuti, the translator should not remain invisible and anonymous in his role of the translator, as Venuti is to vindicate his subjectivity professionally and legally. This approach offers a clear and succinct methodology that can be used to confront the most insidious and problematic aspect of Calvino's prose. In addition, the act of making choices raises important questions of authorship and agency. If the role of AI is to generate a translation, to what extent can they be considered authors of the text? Authorship implies decision-making, intentionality, and engagement with language. When those elements are outsourced to a machine, our role shifts, and as a result, the end product is not fundamentally altered. Analyzing the English translation of Calvino's novels and compare and comment on the different choices adopted by the translator is certainly useful. Many of them have attempted to translate his work. Like I mentioned, William Weaver is one of them, and then there are others, Tim Parks, Martin McLaughlin, George Martin, Patrick Creek, Luis Brigante, Sylvia McClawley, and Peggy Wright. I also looked at the English from England and American translations of the same text. Some of his work has been translated 3 times by different Anglophone speakers, and thought very interesting things came out. Again, I don't have time to go through them, but one example that I want to just show you, I'm just going to skip ahead, is an example posed by Calvino's vocabulary in one of the stories that I find particularly useful to analyze this task of translating cultural terms. Cultural terms, or just particular terms, is the story from Amori Difficili, Difficult Loves, that is called Furto in una pasticceria, Theft in a pastry shop. On this text, we have the translation work by 3 different translators at different times, Weaver, Colquhoun, and Wright. The 3 protagonists of the story, Diritto, Gesù Bambino, and Uora, have very unusual names filled with symbolism, especially in the case of Gesù Bambino, baby Jesus, who recalls, among other elements in the story, the Christmas festivities. The English translation changes the name of Gesù Bambino just with baby, a term that nullifies the moral and ironic charge of the plot, which is Gesù Bambino actually as a thief of the pastry during the Christmas holiday. This again is clearly a case of under-translation and perhaps a wrong translation. But in Italian, and like many languages, especially Calvino, we see a lot of terms that are where translators have to sort of find circumlocutions, or sometimes they're just wrong translations. This is, and we have seen also this in French, but it's a long story. Anyway. Another significant part of this talk is going to dedicate it to the problems related to a recent critical approach to gender. This addressed rather explicitly criticism of Calvino himself, portrayal of women often depicted as negative and passive figures associated with images of danger, punishment, and irrationality. I strongly suggest referring to Louise von Bloton's book, Translation and Gender, and Sharing Simon, Gender in Translation, Cultural Identity, and the Politics of Transmission. They view the translator as a recreator of meaning. Therefore, the translator's subjectivity and the positionality is crucial in generating and constructing cultural values. Their studies also suggest that the translator act can accentuate the misogynist connotation of an author, thus actively contributing to the circulation of discriminatory idea. I will briefly introduce to you the translation done by William Weaver, the translator that I interviewed, and I asked him that question directly later. If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, written by Calvino in 1983. In which he used the character of lettore and lettrice, of course, in many Romance languages, with the suffix, you can differentiate male and female. The choices done by Weaver is very interesting because in this book, presently, we have the translation of the lettore, the male reader just called reader, and the female reader throughout the book, her name is Ludmilla, is called the other reader. Clearly, the translation of the character of the lettrice loses every feminine attribution and becomes the other. In fact, the name does not mention at all the sex of the reader, contrary to what happens in Italian, where the feminine connotation is indicated by the suffix trice. In order to maintain the feminine, Sanchez suggests that in the English translation, Weaver could have rendered the term with female reader or male reader, which proves that the choice made by him was not the only one acceptable. Thus, thus one can speculate that Weaver realized that an implicit misogynist choice, which according to some critics is in line with Calvino's choice, made this even worse. Of course, we all realize that it is objectively difficult to translate gender from Romance languages into English and perhaps versa. And since Italian and since these languages use specific nouns and suffixes to distinguish male from female. I will also go back to Louise von Bloton's book, in which she points out that the lack of gender indicators in the English language, except in a few cases, suggests that it's up to the translator's ethics to resolve the issue by utilizing a more politically correct form. One can't help but notice that the choice made by Weaver has a negative connotation for women and also implicitly helps to modify the image of the female character. The translation of lettrice with other reader becomes discriminatory for the female image and contributes to psychologically increase the prejudice against her. In fact, the term other signifies, among other things, different from the norm, contrary to what is right and just. In other words, it carries a negative and nullifying connotation. Confronted with the accusation of implicit misogyny, William Weaver himself told me when I interviewed him that he does not attribute any importance to this criticism, stating that the term other does not have any particular implication. I quote the translation because we spoke in Italian, but what he said to me, I did not find something better, so I used it. It is a solution that comes from desperation, and so that was the one that I came up with. Before, I thought of naming the character Reader 1 and Reader 2, but this really seemed offensive for the female character. it becomes apparent that with this answer, William showed that he was not very sensitive regarding the question of gender and does not know what other solutions are achievable. This is not the only example. There's another example in another short novel of Calvino in which there is a cashier, a female cashier, and in the English translation, you could read the whole short story and never know that the cashier is a woman. So it seems that the translator had some difficulty when translating gender. In light of these theories covered in brief, and the examples provided, it's clear that the work of a translator is paramount to the success of any work. This is particularly emphasized by Lawrence Venuti in his book, The Scandals of Translations. He underlined that the work of a translator is often underappreciated, underpaid, and invisible. And with this talk, I tried to demonstrate how the work of the translator is instead relevant and demanding, filled with responsibility regarding the accuracy and the enjoyment of the translative piece. One major benefit that the translation forces us to really focus on difference rather than the erasure, but then the canceling of difference. And AI tools, if used, tend to smooth language, like Julie said, into standardized, highly legible input. That is useful for efficiency, but could also, flatten cultural nuance, ambiguity, and the selective choices. In doing so, and seeking a militant and responsible translation, we support cultural attentiveness that is socially valuable. It resists the idea that communication is purely transactional. Translators are not converting words; they're really negotiating, as you can see here, how cultures are being represented. This raises question about what should be preserved, adapted, and explained. These decisions shape how cultures are perceived. In an academic setting, it becomes opportunity to discuss power and representation between languages. My conclusion is, it is also important to acknowledge the strength of AI as a tool. The ability to generate accurate and fluent translation is precisely what makes it so appealing and so potentially disruptive in an academic and professional setting. However, we should not be primarily concerned with efficiency, but instead with the development of critical thinking and expressive ability. In this light, the fact that AI can do it better is not an argument for its uncritical adoption, but rather a reason to reconsider how and when it should be used. A more productive approach may not be to exclude AI entirely. Perhaps if we teach a translation course, we might ask students to translate a piece and then have AI translate it and have a discussion about how with the students how that what are the differences and what are the benefits or things that are completely missed. In doing so, AI becomes a tool for reflection rather than a substitute for effort. It is through this process that we develop the skills, awareness, and agency that define true language learning outcomes that no algorithm, however advanced, can fully replicate. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Professors Trubikhina and also Professor Guarnieri. Did I pronounce them better than before? All right, so before we go to lunch, does anyone have any questions for the two professors? Okay, awesome. Eliza? Yes.
Yeah, I'm just talking, I think the AI conversation is really interesting, particularly when it comes to like accuracy and gender bias. I think like considering that AI builds on what already exists out there, and a lot of text out there already has implicit gender bias. I think that we need to be careful with AI translations and gender bias, since I think it's not creating, think of new ways around this problem with translating gender into English. And I think it's much more likely to continue with this same trend of othering, in this context, women, but also there's been evidence of gender and racial bias in AI, given that it bases, its response on what is already out there, and a lot of the text out there is already very prejudiced.
Do you guys have anything to add on, or?
I agree with you, and exactly like you said, AI is fed by us, and we are not here, but in general, we are biased, we are racist, we are, so AI is all the stuff that is fed is us. What we say, what we write, whatever catches is its algorithm is based on us, and we are imperfect human beings. So yeah, definitely is an issue. But also human beings have an issue with gender. I've seen this. I've been working this for now 20 years, and I've seen a lot of, and the main work has been done by Canadian literary theorists, and in Belgium they have a great school for gender in translation. They've done for many years. Even looked at the translation of the Bible. How that is, is very interesting in terms of gender. Again, AI would make these, but also human beings have made a lot of these mistakes.
Thank you so much. Yeah, very interesting to hear your comments. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Any other questions before we go to lunch? Great. So we have any other questions before we head out? All right. So in the back, yes? The cat. Sure thing. Give me a little bit. All right. Let me just check the chat very quickly. Good morning from Boston University. And all right, someone has to head out. Okay, very cool. We just have to head out. All right, awesome. So in the back we have concession, and we have catering in the back. So if nobody has a question, then everyone please enjoy your lunch. There's also coffee in the back and water as well. Great, thank you.
with the next portion of the conference. Our next speaker is Olivia C. Caputo, and her talk is called Palimpsetic Double, Toil, and Trouble, the intersection of text and audience in the translation of Macbeth. Take the floor, yes.
I know everyone wanted to talk about Shakespeare, so here we are. Yes, that's fine. Okay, so hopefully they can also see that full screen, but I'm going to get started. So my talk is called Palimpsestic Double, Toil, and Trouble, and I have sort of changed the title a little bit to A Case for Viewing Translation as Adaptation. My name is Olivia C. Caputo. I have my master's in translation and interpreting from the University of Westminster in London, and I currently work as a subtitle translator primarily. All right, so my goal here is to utilize the language and theory of adaptation based mainly on the work of Gerard Genette and Linda Hutchin as a framework to explore translation. And I'll be using the example of Leon Felipe's 1954 translation of Macbeth. I hope to demonstrate through the examination of one such translation and adaptation that both practices are inherently creative rather than merely derivative acts and should be studied as such to fully understand how they engage with their source texts and target audiences. I also believe that this process is inherently human, as only human opinions, prior experience, and viewpoints can selectively inform how a work is created or received in this way. AI can scour the internet for seemingly endless resources, but it lacks the discernment or ability to filter those resources through any lived experience, as humans can and do and must. So, in A Theory of Adaptation, Linda Hutchin describes the act of adaptation as repetition without replication. She also says that, from the adapter's perspective, adaptation is always a double process of interpreting, then creating something new. This description, as acknowledged by Hutchin, also inherently describes translation. And both are often considered derivative works under copyright law, but translation is characterized by an assumed fidelity to the source, whereas adaptation is often perceived as having a change in form and perhaps even content. Katja Krebs argues, however, that they should be considered together. Both translation and adaptation are interdisciplinary by their very nature. Both discuss phenomena of constructing cultures through acts of rewriting, and both are concerned with the collaborative nature of such acts and the subsequent critique of notions of authorship. All of this echoes Gerard Genette's view of translation. The wisest thing for the translator would no doubt be to admit that he can only do badly and to force himself nevertheless to do as well as he can, which often means doing something different. Now, male pronoun aside there. My questions are, by implementing the language of adaptation to examine translations, what can we learn about how translated texts function and relate to their sources and their audience? And can AI, which is derivative by nature, even when we label it generative AI, replicate the act of adaptation in a meaningful way? So, in his book, Palimpsests, Literature in the Second Degree, Genette codifies the various relationships between a source and its target. These targets are the titular palimpsests, and the term originally describes a manuscript in which a later writing is written over and effaced earlier writing. For both Genette and Hutchin, palimpsest describes works that contain two texts in one, both the invisible source and the visible target, the adapted text, and the adaptation. It is of note that even Shakespeare's Macbeth is actually an adaptation of Scottish history and Holinshed's Chronicles, but for the purposes of this presentation, it is being considered as only the source text. Genette states that the most visible form of transposition, and certainly the most widespread, consists in transposing a text from one language to another. Genette's inclusion of translation, in addition to and in conjunction with the other relationships that can exist between texts, encourages an examination of translated works as creative and interpretive endeavors. Genette's framework allows us to focus on textual shifts that are not merely the result of linguistic transfer, but rather the creative choices of a translator and author. In fact, for translation as adaptation to be fully understood, we have to actively engage with these creative choices, because if we ignore them or simply label them as unfaithful translations, we deny the translator's agency and fail to acknowledge the creativity of their work. But how do audiences interact with these works? Hutchin writes that seen from the perspective of its process of reception, adaptation is a form of intertextuality. We experience adaptations, as palimpsests through our memory of other works that resonate through repetition with variation. Hutchin makes a distinction between two audience types, the knowing and the unknowing. A knowing audience is familiar with the source text, while an unknowing audience is viewing the adaptation as a standalone. The two audiences will experience a work differently because adaptation as adaptation involves, for its knowing audience, an interpretive doubling or a conceptual flipping back and forth between the work we know and the work we are experiencing. She labels this dialogic relationship palimpsestic doubleness. There are two things I'd like to point out here. First, the notion of palimpsestic doubleness is closely related, in my mind, to, I'm going to pronounce this, Egil Tornquist's gossiping or feedback effect, which is a concept that's actually expanded by Jorge Diaz-Cintas and Eileen Rimail in their work on audiovisual translation. Because subtitles are presented at the same time as the source language dialogue, it invites comparison and often criticism from viewers who have a little knowledge of the source language, but not much knowledge of translation. I hold that Hutchin's conceptual flipping back and forth is, in fact, a manifestation of the gossiping effect, but one that's made possible by palimpsestic doubleness. It just depends on the knowing spectator's memory of the source while viewing the target, rather than having them presented side by side. Secondly, I do think that linguistic transfer is the main reason that people fail to connect translation and adaptation more. When you introduce a new language, the likelihood of having a knowing audience will, by default, decrease. You're entering a new cultural sphere with a different set of references and major works. But I will note that Macbeth has existed in the Castilian language since the beginning of the 19th century, and even those with indirect cultural knowledge could possibly experience the work as a palimpsest because of its international canonical status. I think a view of translation as adaptation, even for less canonical works, is a step towards recognizing the authorship and creativity of translators, the same way we might celebrate Mike Flanagan for his adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House, for example. The effect of viewing translations as adaptations is that we can play this game of spot the difference made possible by palimpsestic doubleness. And those differences, when they are deliberate choices made by a translator and author, become more meaningful for that tension and allow us to explore a text for its many layers of meaning and thereby pick out an adapter's priorities and intent, which is what I'll now proceed to do with Leon Felipe's Macbeth o El Asesino del Sueño. There we go. All right, so the subtitle already sets up an expectation of interpretive intervention between the source and target because it uses the word paraphrase. Interestingly, though, the definition of paraphrase does mention rewording, which is necessitated by translation, but it goes on to state the rewording's purpose as making the sense clearer. Now, you could argue that translation makes the sense clearer for speakers of the target language, but Felipe definitely also has more interpretive intentions here. I'd say most of Felipe's interventions fall under Jeanette's category of aggravation, which serves to emphasize its source text's secret bent. In fact, Felipe in the play's introduction specifically mentions his enthusiasm to underline and stretch the cries and the echoes of the original. Amongst others, the two key elements that Felipe aggravates, and that I will focus on today, are the concept of time and the play's circular structure. In their introduction to the Arden Third Series Macbeth, Sandra Clark and Pamela Mason note the play's already present preoccupation with time. Its delineation in action and its conceptualization has a special role in Macbeth. There's a wealth of language in the original regarding the indistinguishability of night from day. We have Macbeth saying, "By the clock 'tis day, and yet dark night strangles the traveling lamp. Is night's predominance or the day's shame that darkness does the face of the earthen tomb when living light should kiss it?" He later asks his wife, "What is the night?" To which she replies, "Almost at odds with morning, which is which?" The word time itself is used 46 times in the text of Macbeth. But Felipe aggravates the play's temporal uncertainty by focusing on the idea of tomorrow as well. For example, when the witches first greet Macbeth with their prophecies in Shakespeare, they state to Macbeth, "Thou shalt be king hereafter." In Felipe's version, they proclaim, "Hail Macbeth, you will be king tomorrow," making the prophecy feel much more urgent than it is in the original. But Felipe further complicates the urgency in Macbeth's following soliloquy, ruminating on the witch's prophecy after his sudden promotion to Thane of Cawdor. In it, Macbeth asks the following: "Tomorrow, when is tomorrow?" In history, they say tomorrow without specifying the time, like yesterday. People use yesterday to mean something that happened years ago, and tomorrow, we don't know when that something could happen. That tomorrow, then, is not tomorrow itself. When is tomorrow? How many years away is tomorrow? What does "you will be king tomorrow" mean? There were 3 premonitions, and the second has come true in less than an hour. How long will I wait to be king? Tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. When is tomorrow? Is tomorrow in 10 years or when the cock crows at dawn? And if tomorrow is actually tomorrow, within a few hours, in order for the premonition to come true, what will happen? Oops, didn't mean to jump that far. No, go back. Bear with me. There we go. This speech alone, which has no corresponding segment in the source, includes the word mañana, or tomorrow, 16 times. And Felipe's Macbeth's exploration of the literal meaning as the following day and the metaphorical meaning as analogous with the hereafter heightens the sense that the play's plot is at once urgent and indeterminate. Another example of the replacement of hereafter with tomorrow occurs after Lady Macbeth's death is announced. In Shakespeare, Macbeth responds, "She should have died hereafter," and launches into the famous tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech. In Felipe's play, sorry, a lot of clicking going on here. In Felipe's play, instead he responds, "She should have died yesterday or tomorrow." For Macbeth, as noted earlier, yesterday does not necessarily mean the day before today, and tomorrow, not necessarily the following. So where Shakespeare's Macbeth wishes to postpone his wife's death, Felipe's Macbeth wants her death to occur any time other than the present. He claims that perhaps then there would have been time to understand those words. Now what does it mean to say the queen has died? For Felipe's Macbeth, at this moment, those words signify nothing. Moving on to our next aggravation, the linguistic and thematic parallels between the original play's end and beginning have caused some critics to suggest that the play is part of a cycle that will be repeated. Duncan, like Malcolm, overcomes a treacherous foe to reclaim Scotland's throne before being killed and replaced by a tyrant. In light of this parallel, the triumph of Malkin at the play's end is tainted by the threat of subsequent tyranny. In their introduction, Clark and Mason write that the linkage of the play's ending with its beginnings has been accorded a kind of aesthetic elegance by MJB Allen, who cites Macbeth as an exemplar of that sort of tragedy whose ends are fully anticipated in their beginnings, and calls it the most circular and self-contained of all of Shakespeare's plays. They go on to acknowledge that some stagings of the play have developed the disquieting implications of the circularity by bringing the sisters on at the end. And Felipe actually writes this ending into his play. The circularity is also highlighted by the language of the opening and closing scenes, which contain stark echoes of each other. In fact, the lines with which the witches open and close the first and last scenes are identical. The thunder precedes and announces us, a black wind bears and accompanies us here, voleverum, voleverum, voleverum. Voleverum is not a Spanish word. It's actually in Latin, first person singular pluperfect active indicative of volo, which means to wish. But many Spanish words can be extrapolated from it. There are the verbs volar, to fly, and volver, to return. Volveremos, which is phonetically similar, means we will return, and verum means truth in Latin. Thus, the word carries associations of wishing, flying, returning, revolving, and speaking truth of what's to come. And its repetition 3 times aids in its evocation of that circularity. Stepping outside of the text itself, another layer that deepens our reading of translations as adaptations is their historical context. As noted by Hutchin, the context in which we experience the adaptations, cultural, social, historical, is another important factor in the meaning and significance we grant this ubiquitous palimpsestic form. Felipe, though living in exile in Mexico at the time, translated Macbeth during Francisco Franco's fascist regime in Spain. Already a well-known Spanish poet and supporter of the defeated Spanish Republican forces, Felipe had fled Spain after the Spanish Civil War, which resulted in Franco's rise to power. Despite his political leanings, which are more fully explored in his poetry, Felipe mostly avoids any overarching thematic condemnation of Francoism in the play, and Juan Jesus Saro points out that his Macbeth was banned in Spain not because of anything objectionable in the play itself, but because of its author's reputation. My goal here was to demonstrate, yes, I know it's about to restart, how reading translations as adaptations will highlight differences that reveal the priorities and concerns of the translator as a creative author. And so to conclude, I want to point out one more seemingly minor difference that I think takes on much more meaning when we view this translation as an adaptation. Because despite Felipe's ostensible depoliticization of this play, I believe this difference hints at a connection between Macbeth's opponents and Franco's enemies, the Spanish Republican forces. In Shakespeare, Malcolm flees to England and Donalbain to Ireland after their father's murder. But in Felipe's version, Malcolm decides, I won't leave Scotland. I'll hide myself in the mountains. Later, Satan tells Macbeth that the crown prince is in Scotland. They say that he gathers factions and troops, shepherds and commoners. The whole kingdom looks for him and flocks to him like ants to an ant's hill. I suspect that Felipe drew inspiration for this choice from the anti-fascist guerrilla fighters of post-war Spain, who hid in the Spanish mountains from which they launched attacks after Franco came to power. The parallels between a defeated force waiting in the mountains, gathering strength to overthrow a despotic military leader, and the guerrilla forces in Spain would be particularly relevant to a Spanish Republican poet in exile. But this reading only comes about from a knowing audience member viewing the translation as an adaptation. And only a doubly knowing audience member who's aware of both the original play and the historical context will be aware that the guerrilla forces in Spain failed to depose Franco, where Malcolm's army succeeds. So Felipe's fictional rebellion therefore diverges from the Spanish history it imitates. By deliberately altering the plot to keep Malcolm in the Scottish mountains, gathering forces to fight Macbeth, Felipe artistically reclaims the history of his own country and hints at a better fictional ending than reality provided him. I'd like to refer back to the aggravated notion of temporal uncertainty that I explored earlier. We know that Felipe was living as an exile from a Spain that had fallen to his enemies. For Felipe, any allegorical connection between Malcolm's victory and Spanish freedom is, therefore, like Macbeth's mañana, not a temporal certainty, but rather an indeterminate future, and there is no way of knowing how or when it will come about. In the end, Felipe did not return to Spain after his self-imposed exile in 1938. He died 7 years before Franco's own death ended his rule. But if the end is the beginning, maybe there's always a chance for a different outcome next time. So to conclude, the prevalent popular way of viewing translations as derivative works that call for an assumed faithfulness to their source text while also being asked to function independently in the target culture is not unlike how Hutchin describes the unknowing audience's interactions with an adaptation as simply experiencing the work without the palimpsestic doubleness that comes with knowing. From one perspective, this is a loss. From another, it is simply experiencing the work for itself, and all agree that even adaptations must stand on their own. Jeanette feels similarly, citing one of literature's most famous adaptations, James Joyce's Ulysses, to make his point. It is perfectly possible to read Ulysses as a self-enclosed work. Such a reading would, nevertheless, be incomplete. For those in the know, examining translations as adaptations can help us to comprehend not only the linguistic shifts that occur, but also the ways in which a translator creatively intervenes to set their work apart from the source beyond those changes explained away by a bilingual dictionary. We can enjoy the palimpsestic doubleness of adaptation and observe how translations enact that something different championed by Jeanette. AI, by its very nature, cannot have lived experience, which I think is vital to this kind of writing and reading. And so my argument is that if we view translations more as adaptations, we have a more solid foundation for proving to those outside the field that translation is an inherently creative endeavor and that translators should be considered authors in their own right. Were this research to continue, I think the next step would be a deeper dive into AI and how it generates text, and particularly translated text, from an actual mechanical standpoint, in order to understand its processes for selective inclusion of information and the calculations that go into large language model outputs. This would also involve examining translated texts that are less overtly paraphrasing their sources through the same lens that I've applied to Leon Felipe here. And you can see there my work cited and referenced. Thank you very much. Any questions? I'll just start it. I know where we're going. Yes, stop share. Yes. I don't know if you want to. Yep.
So my line of work is what you'd call transcreation. So in reality, I deal with AI all the time, trying to maximize the lifespan of my brain cells. One thing I've realized is that although indeed AI doesn't have the ability to discern and make creative decisions, but you can. The power of AI is that it's tireless. You can just tell it over and over again what you want to achieve, and it will try maybe 200 times to get the result that you are satisfied with. I do experiments like that from time to time, including something pretty wild, like adapting T.S. Eliot's famous poem, The Wastelands, into classic Chinese poetry. So how do you feel about a future where the problem is not the lack of human agency, but the hypothetical situation that translators are reduced to just the human agency, leaving all the rest to AI?
I mean, I think this might be out of, oh no, it's okay. I think that sort of you've already touched on what I would say to that, which is that you're addressing using AI as a tool to aid human agency. And so the person actually ultimately making the creative decisions is the human in that situation. And so just like, I translate using a dictionary and online forums, and all of those are useful tools in my toolbox. But at the end of the day, I am the one making that creative decision. I think the issue comes in, and what I'm trying to encourage people away from, is when they try to replace the human with the tool rather than let the tool be an aid to the human. Because the situation you're describing, you ultimately are still making the ultimate decision. You're saying, here are these, 200 different outputs that it's given me, but this is the one that I, as a human with my experience and my creative intent, want to use.
Anyone else? Any more questions?
I think to Kane's point, I just want to add that I think we don't have much to worry about, those of us in this room, just scanning across. But we do have a lot to worry about when it comes to the arena of education, because the human agency needs to be exercised. They're like muscles, right? That if we haven't even learned, all of these wonderful things, that we take for granted, a lot of us, in our work process, then we perhaps may never learn because AI is too kind, like someone said this morning, right? And youngsters would not get into the uncomfortable spot of aggravation, which is what we need.
I'm trying to think of how to phrase this as a specific question, but I'm just wondering. I guess I'm wondering if we really get behind this view of translations, especially literary translations as adaptational works, then how do we to sort of vulgarize a little, like how do we sell it to publishers?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because people do have that assumed faithfulness. And I think that's part of the issue is the idea that one can be faithful in a new language is slightly loaded, because what it is doing is prioritizing one language over the other, whereas they are just completely separate things. And the things that I can and do express in English have to be expressed differently in Spanish because it's just a different structure. And that becomes even more stark for languages that are even less related. So, going from English to Spanish, yeah, sure, Romance language, it's different. But going from English to something like Japanese or Mandarin, you introduce even more variables. And I think it's sort of a dual thing of public education where more people, I would love them to be aware of the actual, I don't know, I think so many people who are monolingual live in a world where every other language is just a one-for-one sort of transfer of what they speak. Whereas those of us who actually speak one or more, or two or more languages understand that there are just certain things that are not untranslatable, but that need to be expressed in a different way. And so, like Jeanette says, if you can only do something different, why not make that something different interesting? Does that kind of answer your question?
I was just wondering, when you're talking about adaptation and creativity and AI, do you consider the part where, from my perspective, one of the problems with AI is the misconception of what a brain is and how it takes prior knowledge and recombines it and regurgitates it out, right? Which is not the way a neural network is not a brain.
Mm-hmm.
It takes things that were done by a brain and then, does cocktail mixing, then regurgitates out thousands of different ways of recombining that information, but that's not what a brain does. A brain is sitting inside a body, and that body experiences temperature, tiredness, it experiences aesthetic enjoyment of what it's doing. So when you're translating, you're not only just regurgitating one of 1,000 different ways of saying the same thing, you're regurgitating the one that appeals to you the most because it's beautiful, it sounds a certain way, it expresses something that touches you deeply in ways that are caused by your neurotransmitters, and neural networks don't have neurotransmitters, right? So to me, the entire experience of a human brain doing this kind of stuff is the whole point. The point is not just taking stuff. I appreciate Jeanette, using the palimpsests as a kind of metaphor, but it's a very incomplete metaphor because the experience, I don't know if anyone here is into medieval manuscripts the way I am. I'm a medievalist. And when you handle a medieval manuscript, the point is not what's written in it. It's the experience of touching it, of hearing the cracking of the vellum as you turn the pages and the illuminations shining in your face. It's an aesthetic experience. There's no way to translate that. There's no way to adaptate that. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that makes sense. So what do you think is the role of that perspective in keeping the human aspect of translation relevant, as opposed to just the machine plagiarizing everything we've ever done and regurgitating it in new and attractive ways for us, I guess? Do you consider that there's something there?
Yes, I think I understand what you're saying. I'm not a materialist, so I'm not necessarily thinking about the actual physical volume that I'm holding in front of me at all times, though clearly I prioritize it enough to have brought the copy today. But I do think that it's sort of what I was saying about like AI can repeat others' lived experiences. It can pull from everyone's lived experiences that have been fed into it, but it cannot have those lived experiences itself. And so I think that what we need to do is start thinking of translations not as this, tome that fell from the sky, like it's the Book of Mormon and it has no author. It is something that was co-authored by a source author and a target author. And if we look at both of those people, including authors on the cover of translations and their names is a huge step towards it, something that we're seeing more and more. I do think that there is more highlighting of the actual translator as well as the author when we present translated literature. I think we need to push that to the max, and we need to see them not as, source, target, but as two equal co-authors. And I do think that plays like this are a very good example of that. And then you add in a director who is another co-author, because every stage performance of a theater piece is its own thing. And I go into Patrice Pavis and receptive concretizations in the full paper. But I think my point is everyone who touches a work who is bringing their own lived experience to it is a co-author. And AI can't do that because it has no lived experience. All right, I think I'm out of time pretty much. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you very much, Olivia, for that beautiful presentation that sparked such a nice conversation. Next up, we have Carolyn Shread. She's a senior lecturer in French at Mount Holyoke College, and she teaches translation at Smith College. She'll be presenting Beyond the Constraints of an Instructor's Linguistic Competencies, using AI to teach artisanal translation.
Thank you. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. So thank you for setting up some of the questions that I hope I'll be discussing with you today. I'm interested in thinking about the place of AI between the two humans, the teachers and students. Let's just put that as a general characterization. And so the title of this paper, as was said, is Beyond the Constraints of an Instructor's Linguistic Competencies, Using AI to Teach Artisanal Translation. So the context of that this is coming from is from teaching translation in a small liberal arts college, and it concerns an undergraduate student population where the objective, my main learning objective, is to teach translation literacy, and alongside that, AI or machine translation literacy to students who are majoring in Romance languages. Okay. So let me just start. Even before I say that, I think it's important to talk about our embodied experience and to give you a little bit of a personal statement on my own AI use in translation. So I am also, alongside being a teacher, a professional translator of 16 books, and that translation is integral to my scholarship. It's not a task, it's not an inconvenience, it's my hermeneutic practice, it's where I do my thinking. And 8 of my translated books are by the French philosopher Catherine Malabou. When I asked her, she's actually writing a book right now on, she's done a lot around brain plasticity. Plasticity is her main philosophical concept, and she's writing a book right now on AI, and I asked her, is that book going to be translated by AI? And she said no, because I am her voice in English, so long may that be the case. So I do, obviously, like everyone, because it's hard to get away from AI. You know, I'm using it in my searches despite myself. It pops up on your Google, but I never use AI for even a sentence of my translated publications. And I guess the grounds for that is that my voice is my trademark. That's what I'm working on. I did experiment. I needed to understand AI. Oh, hello, that's gone off. Is it run out? Oh, no? Oh, is there another one here? Okay, I'll take that. Okay, thank you. Oh, sure. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I tried using ChatGPT to translate a lecture I'd given twice in English into French. So the concepts were really solidly there. I had the ideas were there. And the result of that experience was completely disconcerting. It did produce a fabrication. It was about 15 pages, and especially to the second part of it, inventing in a very a disconcerting manner. So it was not an interepistemic translation. This was not managing to do that leap. And the worst part about it was at the end, it said, it ended with a lie translated by Carolyn Shread, which definitely it was not. So I want to come back to that point that made by Sebastian Muth that about translation as a signal of privilege. At the same point in translation studies, and we've been thinking a lot about language justice, and I think that still needs to be right at the forefront when we're thinking about AI and human translation. So just to acknowledge that in my own privileged practice of translating philosophy, I'm doing so because I'm supported in my work as a university professor. And so while I'm arguing here for this slow practice of translation, I recognize the context that that's coming out of. In my teaching, my goal is to slow my students down. They have time. And so I will give them assign a 300-word project that they're going to work on for the whole semester. So they're going to pick that. So it has to be meaningful for them to be able to spend that long on it. But the goal is to understand how human agency, or the ability to adapt to text, how far you can go with it, functions in translation. So very important to say, most of my students are never going to become translators. That is not their role in life. All of them will interact personally and professionally with language difference. And my goal is to address that. That's really what I want them to take it from the class. Okay, so now I need to move through this. Okay, great. So here's the outline. So just an introduction where I'll talk a little bit about language versus translation in a way that may or may not make sense to you. I think it depends a little bit on your pedagogies of teaching language. A short caveat and a little bit of a diversion to eco-translation. I'd like to introduce that in this context because we're talking about the human. I don't want us to forget the more than human. Then I'll do a little case study exploring AI in my human classroom, and then a short finding at the end about language acquisition in the age of AI. Okay. So language versus translations. So this is very much coming out of my experience. As I said, there is a long history. In fact, when I was studying languages at Oxford, we were doing tons of completely decontextualized translations. And translation was integral to learning a language. Coming here to the US, immersion and the communicative method was the one that was being used in the classes. And the #1 rule is do not translate, right? That you are meant to be working the language within that. So in that context, translation and translation studies seem to be in conflict and to be in contest with that, even though I would define them as a kind of linguistic reflexivity, intercultural competencies that I think are a wonderful complement, that are completely separate from the ability to either be bilingual. I think that bilinguals do not necessarily have those competencies, or to learn a language. So I'm going to say that these two could be mediated by translation literacy or by machine translation literacy. Okay, so just a little bit of an overview of the type of courses I'm teaching. Teaching language courses from intermediate language to advanced seminars. All of those classes always taught in French.
there is not translation happening in those contexts. And then I teach a variety of translation courses, a first-year seminar, which is entitled Artisanal versus Artificial Translation, a large guest lecture series, The Art of Translation, that's at Smith College, and that's really trying, I have, 60 students, many different majors, 20 different languages in the class. And that's my space to really get that little dose of translation to them. There's an associated French translation practice with that. And then the class I'll be talking about today is Romance Languages Translate, which is an advanced undergraduate seminar. Okay, here we go. Ego translation. If you, I don't know whether you know ego translation or what it is. Essentially, to give it a short, brief definition, it's about going beyond anthropocentric, human-centered translation. It's not about translating texts that are about ecology. It's about translating them more than human. So 2017, Michael Cronin published Eco Translation, Translation and Ecology in the Age of the Anthropocene. And at that point, it was quite fairly prescient of him to write, there is nothing virtual about the ecological impact of the virtual. We weren't yet in the giant data centers that we're in now. Another person who's been very active in eco-translation is Shebnem Susam-Sarayeva. If you look up Eco-Translation Network, these two people are the co-organizers. And she asks, what are the translation rights of a whale? If we're going to be recording using bioacoustics technology, et cetera, we should maybe be thinking, what are the interpreting rights? Can a whale ask for an interpreter? That might seem way out there. I think we need to ask that question in the context of our conference today. Okay, so where did I get to? Yes. And I'll say that because my students are really concerned when I ask about using AI, they are concerned about environmental destruction. That message has got out there and it's circulating. And there's a very immediate equivalence between AI and environmental destruction. And so some of them will say, I'm not using it on those grounds, which I find actually to be quite a cause for hope in some ways. Because the climate crisis is not at the front of most people's minds, and the students, they're not thinking, the ones that I'm meeting, about that. It's coming back in through AI. So that's an interesting thing to think about. So in this seminar, Teaching Romance Languages Translate, this Romance Languages have an advanced seminar. It was normally taught, and the linguistic competencies of the instructors, it would circulate between people in Spanish and Italian and French, would essentially define how the seminar was functioning. So discussions and assignments addressed Romance Languages materials, but they did occur primarily in English. There would be a final paper that would be written in a Romance language sent out to somebody, somebody who knew the language, but who wasn't necessarily teaching the course. So when I began teaching the seminar, I wanted the students to keep on practicing. They love their languages. They've studied abroad. They're coming back. They want to keep practicing them. So I had small group class discussion between the different languages. And let me just give you, here is the course description. I won't read all of it, but just the beginning. The seminar explores Romance languages, literatures, and cultures through the prism of translation by comparing translations from Spanish, Catalan, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, Romance Creoles between each other and into English. Lots of fun asking them to translate from languages that they don't know. We will map out the boundaries, intersections, and middle grounds of this language family. So they are working on individual projects over the course of the semester. And I do have a statement on the syllabus about language and translation. I think I'll read this one out because it's sort of at the crux of what I'm trying to think through here. Language learning and translation enjoy a symbiotic relationship in which studying translation supports and refines language acquisition. However, translation is a discrete skill. This class enhances the knowledge portfolio associated with the study of Romance languages by adding practice and reflection on translation. Building on the advanced language abilities of students in this class, our goal is to focus on the negotiation of spaces between the languages. This intercultural competence offers added value to successful communication within a language and represents a distinct, highly desirable area of study in the mobile global context, including a specific set of skills that exceed AI translation products. So you can see the way I'm setting this up, I'm saying we're going to try and think through translation, and you're going to learn something which is beyond what might be offered by AI translation. So here's a sample assignment. This wonderful collection into English, if you don't know, in 2017, a very useful resource. It has a poem, and then it has 3 different poems associated, plus a commentary. Really fabulous teaching resource. So we've got these in-class group language-specific discussions going on. They're going to be writing a reflective commentary. And what I want to emphasize here is in red. So having done a translation in class and then having read the commentaries, I've asked them to write a reflection in their Romance languages. Now let's remember, I don't know Spanish, I don't know Portuguese. So how is this going to work exactly? There was a moment early on in the early iteration, I had the French students could write in French, but that's not fair because the others were not. So that this was what led me to inch towards machine translation as an option in my teaching. Okay. So the finding, okay, yeah, I'll get there in a moment. So what they're having to do is they have to provide me with access to their work. They can do that through a self-translation. It's more onerous. Some of my students, they're all keen. The ones who didn't want to use AI for ethical reasons did choose to do that. Some of them chose to do it later on in the process. But those who did use AI machine translation, one of the important things they learned they had to do was they had to tell me that there was a transparency expectation. I needed them to tell me what they were using. Sometimes I invited them to use different ones so that they could compare them. But I think getting that habit of you use AI translation, you need to sign it, not Carolyn Shread. When that's a lie, you need to definitely put translated by DeBell or whatever it might be. So what I was trying to develop here are the skills of a discerning language professional. Oops. So I'm going to go back to this notion that the gold standard of learning a language in the institution that I'm working from is immersion. I don't speak the languages, so that would seem to make this immersion impossible. But beyond my competencies, there's obviously other people with their linguistic competencies in the room. So the students are talking to each other in their languages, and they are also doing these written reflections. So I think the best way, okay, hold on, to sort of illustrate what happened and what really prompted was the impetus for this talk. I'm just going to read this self-evaluation. I have the students always write self-evaluations. So with their permission, I was worried that being in a multilingual classroom would decrease my learning rate in Spanish because I would have less opportunities to speak Spanish, but I was very wrong. I feel like I'm still improving my Spanish with every class meeting and every assignment. In class, I'm always able to talk with Spanish speakers. In fact, I think I'm talking more in Spanish in this class than in any other Spanish class because we turn and talk so often. My speaking skills have improved because I'm in an environment where I do not feel judged. Yeah, that's a great advantage. I can't judge them, and so they feel free to actually practice their language. I am often self-conscious of how I speak Spanish, but since I am only talking to a small group of people that I've gotten to know well, I feel comfortable making mistakes. Feeling relaxed is very helpful in any learning situation, but especially in language classes. I think my weekly writing in Spanish is helping me increase the speed at which I can generate written thoughts and translations. In the reflections, I am challenged to continuously discuss translation in a semi-formal manner, similar to class conversations. Therefore, they are simultaneously helping both my speaking and writing skills in Spanish. So this was sort of unexpected. This was midway through the semester, and I'm like, wow, I'm teaching this great Spanish class. Or I'm not. I think what it really forces us to do is to rethink what our role is in a classroom as an instructor. We might not be the defining element in terms of learning. So just thinking about these findings, language acquisition in the age of AI. So between calculating and communicating signs, and I do think of translation very much in terms of signs, a system of semiotics. So a sign that is calculated by AI algorithms that use wildly variable data for their training, which is so very different from a sign that is communicated through an embodied human being. So while we find this colonization, this domination of human translating abilities by computational processing, we're drawn in multiple directions and that language teaching has to confront. And I do think that language departments really are faced with this radical proposition that AI makes at least, and I think we always have to, when we're keeping language justice at the forefront, AI makes highly resourced language acquisition obsolete. Why do you need to do it, right? That's a hard question that language departments don't necessarily want to answer. And I think it's where they need the allyship with translation studies all the more. A reactionary response that would ban AI on the grounds that undermines language learning. I think the example that I'm talking about, and this is of course an advanced language course. I think it does matter what level we're talking about. So trying to think about how those different things come into play. And I'm just going to end with one further idea that I found quite interesting about sustainable language and going back to this notion of eco-translation. So this quote here is suggesting that we reconstrue language acquisition in terms of sustainable language, recognizing the unique nature of human language acquisition and asking, this is actually, it was in a call for papers for a conference. So would it be useful to conceive of language acquisition as an exceptional form of accumulation that contrasts toxic forms of extractivism, cultural and environmental? So I'll just leave you with that question there. I don't have an answer, but I love the question. So thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I'm curious because you talk about sort of this pivot towards how do we still prioritize language acquisition in a world of AI? How also, and you can tell me that this is outside of your scope, but does sort of a more anti-capitalist approach to sort of learning help with that? Because a lot of the questions surrounding whether or not language acquisition in a formal setting is useful is based on a future job market that someone is trying to enter, as opposed to the pursuit of learning for the sake of learning. And is there a way that you see to integrate that more into language programs?
Yeah, hi, thank you. I think each of these questions bring us back to this thorny question, the place of privilege in here. Because if I claim that, yes, this is absolutely about an existential experience and that is what language acquisition is about, I do think that is I think it's a useful, helpful practice. Was always a weak argument. I didn't like it in the first place. Now it's become, like I said, obsolete for certain languages, but which opens up a space for a different question, which is, as a human being, what are we going to do with our brains, to quote Catherine Malabou? What are we going to do with our bodies? What are we going to do? And I think learning a language is a really great option. We know that actually it does change the brain. So that I would definitely make that argument. What that means is you're going to have to do hard work. You're going to have to do a ton of memorizing in an era where that's not fun and it feels old-fashioned. But I do think that there's a level to which language acquisition does require that type of work. So, yeah.
Just taking it along the same line, because what you said about language learning changing the brain takes me to the matter of process, right? That to me, teaching anything, language just being, I guess, one very specific process of learning, is about the process more than what you're learning, right? What we're doing is building brain capacity with the process of learning, right? So the whole point of something is the process of learning changes your brain. I remember one of my mentors when I was doing my PhD there was the debate before AI was like, why do we have to learn Latin? Isn't it a language? Why are they torturing us with Latin? And I remember him telling me, it's not the same having learned Latin and then forgotten it than having never learned Latin. And that stuck to me, but because to me as an interpreter is the same thing. Many of my students are never going to be interpreters, but I tell them, you learning how to interpret, your brain's never going to be the same. Even if you turn out not to ever interpret again, this did something to your brain. And isn't it the point of us sitting in classrooms or in Zoom now, I guess, to learn stuff, the fact that we're training our brain to be better at being a brain, right? Rather than whatever it is that we're teaching or learning, which goes more to taste and marketability and job market than to questions about, is it worth learning? So to me, when you ask, what are we going to do with our brains? It's, I guess, make them better, because our brains are sustainable. They're not data centers, right? And this evolution thing did something right. It made our brains sustainable, right? And in a way that, I mean, I don't see AI getting there anytime soon. So I'm not sure, how do you, is the process to you one of the points of the overview you gave us?
Yeah, I would say it's absolutely the center. When I talk about slowing down and not trying to massively, and students are like, yeah, I've done the translation, what do I do now? That's so frustrating for them when you make them do it over 5 times over. They're like, I have nothing. And that's the point where they get pushed into creative spaces. So, and then the fact that they not only have to do it 5 times, they have to talk about it 5 times. So I do think that it is all about the process. And I do think it is about staying with something and really giving it its time. So yeah, thank you.
Not a question, but I just wanted to give you a shout out. We read your chapter on ecological approaches in translation I'm a Hunter student, so in our class, we actually spent a week looking at your chapter. It was very challenging to a lot of the students, but it was really mind-opening to kind of think on translation on a whole other level. So thank you for that.
Yeah, that reading really challenged us. We talked about ecological translation and deep time and all that are just things that you don't think about in the regular realm of translation, but it was very interesting to have that approach. Thank you for that. Any questions in the Zoom? No. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carolyn. And now, last but not least, we're going to be looking at making museums bilingual, strategies and challenges in Spanish, presented by Cris, Scorza, and Viridiana Garcia, Choy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for staying this late. We are the last ones. So, and while we open the PowerPoint, let me introduce myself. I am Viridiana Garcia Choy, and I currently work at the Whitney Museum of American Art with Cris Scorza, who is the chair of education. And she is the leader, just starting the Whitney Making Fully Bilingual.
So hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Cris Scorza, as Viri said, head of education at the Whitney Museum of American Art. I'm a brown Latina using pronouns she, her, ella, and I describe myself as a short statue, salt and pepper hair. I'm not wearing glasses at this moment, but generally are. And I am wearing a green olive sweater, a white shirt, and black pants, and funky white and black shoes. And I do this so that we can become more inclusive also to those that are low vision or blind. But I'm going to pass it on to Viri.
So we call this talk, Making Museum Bilinguals, Strategy and Challenges in Spanish. And we are trying to cover a couple of topics. Obviously, they are not like responses or statements are always changing. And we're taking the Whitney Museum as a primary case of a study. We explore the growing need for public institutions to become bilingual into Spanish, mainly in the United States and New York City. Highlights, we're going to approach some highlights, key challenges and innovations in this transition. We start working at the museum in 2021, working in the education department, but Cris will give you more the history about it. We examine the evolution of Spanish and beyond interpretation through these 4 years that we've been working on. It's not just how you mentioned in many texts here. It's not about just the literal translation. It requires a lot of conversation, dialogue, and disagreement. And positions Spanish has a form of artistic expression central to the U.S. cultural vibrancy. So, and at this point, we just realized that we're making a statement in Spanish in certain exhibitions. So from like starting from scratch to just getting the language also a view of artistic approach in every level. So, and we start with obviously a geographic map of New York. And over the 30 years, Spanish-speaking communities in New York have been redistributed and diversified. The Bronx maintains a strong Caribbean presence, especially Dominican, alongside a historic Puerto Rican base. In Washington Heights and Inwood, Dominican identity shapes economic and cultural life. Queens stands out for its Latin American diversity with growing Mexican, Ecuadorian, Colombian, and Central American communities. In Brooklyn, neighborhoods like Sunset Park and Brunswick are home to Mexican and Central American populations alongside longer established Puerto Rican communities. In Manhattan, areas such as El Barrio and Los Aida have been seeing a decline in Puerto Rican residents due to displacement. So in this map, we just take the last census, and you will see the white communities in the green areas, the black communities in the yellow areas, and you will see a high density of purple for the Hispanics, and the red areas in this size are Asians. And here there is another map with the dominant communities of Latinos are distributed in New York. But after this, I will pass the mic to Cris.
Thank you. So the work did not begin from scratch. In 2018, my colleague Marcela Guerrero, who's the curator for Latinx art at the museum, had the exhibition Pachayata Huachichtai, which was an exhibition of both design and architecture of Latin America. And this is the first time that through her efforts and that of her peers, the museum introduced a bilingual exhibition at the request of the artist. The Whitney is described as an artist museum, so really responding to their needs is at the center of the work we do. And since then, we have now translated more exhibitions that follow Vida Americana that some of you might have seen briefly. It got interrupted by the pandemic. And in 2021, Viri and I joined the team. I had come from California, San Diego, where most museums have been translated into Spanish since 1980. So for me, it was a given that museums would have this practice of interpretation to connect more broadly with their community. And when I arrived back in New York and visited the Whitney for my interview, I was shocked to not encounter my language, not because I cannot read English or have not been trained as an art historian in the English language, but because I thought, how is my mother going to understand the work that I very much enjoy, even if she also understands English, but much more enjoys learning something new in her own language. So here are some of our examples of translation. And as Viri has said, is not a process of just translation. It is transliteration, it is conversation, it is artistry, it is creating work that is in conversation with artists. Later, as we progressed, the largest exhibition we translated and where we started introducing the translation of more exhibitions was with No Existe un Mundo Post Huracán, artists after Hurricane Maria, and that opened in conjunction with Hopper's New York. And when that exhibition was scheduled, I said to our director, it is all fantastic that we will translate this exhibition about Puerto Rican art and that we will probably welcome a very large contingency of both Puerto Rican artists and audiences. But Puerto Ricans don't only like Puerto Rican art. And if we're going to have Hopper New York on view, we ought to translate American art as well. It is as American as Puerto Rican. So we did, and we started that process. And we started with what we call partial translation, where we knew that the efforts were not, based on our timeline, were not going to get us there. We had over 200 works of art in that exhibition. So translating every label is quite an undertaking. So we decided not to translate object labels, but we did translate extended labels. So here are our goals, and I'm going to read a little bit. We center language justice. And what we mean by that, we want people to continue to have language acquisition. I'm a parent of a bilingual child who learns Spanish at home, knows how to read it, write it, understand it. And if I want the next generation to be able to continue that, I need to continue to reintroduce the language and make it present. So that's a part of the process. We want equitable experiences. We want participants to feel that they're welcome in any language. And we want to do it across all of our journeys, whether you visit the museum as you buy your tickets and you enter the floor, or if you're consuming our experiences online. And then we want to also sustain that and not just make it about what's on the gallery walls, but about the experience. So we now have also programming in Spanish and bilingually through bilingual educators. And here are some of the considerations. Of course, this is an expensive endeavor. Translation is something that we chose to invest in, and we knew we had to do it over time. So we started with some exhibitions, and then we went building little by little, year by year, until now, July of 2025, the entire Whitney Museum is fully translated. And that is also going in hand with our work in acquisitions. We have increased our acquisitions of Latinx artists. Just to cite an example, the 2022 biennial had 12% Latinx representation. The 2024 biennial had 21% representation. The 2026 biennial, which you're welcome to come visit, has 25% representation. So we're getting closer to the demographic representation of Latinos in the US and Latinos in New York City. So it's part of that process. We have since translated 36 exhibitions. And we continue to make efforts to continue to translate. And there's so many questions we have. There's more questions than answers. Do we translate wayfinding? Do we resort on other strategies? For example, in wayfinding, we are exploring the idea of moving away from full just words and into icons to introduce access at different levels that are not just through language, but through visual. And of course, ASL and Braille are also part of our process of translation. And here's just an example of why it's important to us. It is important because it makes our communities feel welcome and that they
belong. And I'm just going to do one more slide and then pass it on to Viri. Here is a workflow of our process. And I know it's a small, we start English text first. They then get reviewed in Spanish. Then they change. And it's sent to artists and curators. They're an integral part of the process, especially those artists for whom Spanish is their first language. We want to make sure that their language is used in the way that they intended. We work with over 5 translators in Spanish from different countries: Puerto Rico, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, Ecuador. And sometimes we work with some more than others, depending on who's the artist that we're working with or the exhibitions team. It goes to publications for copy editing, and it goes to an editor in Spanish and a proofwriter, and then it goes into graphic design, and then it goes back again. In layout, we do another round of translation, and it takes a lot of people. Viri runs a very tight ship of translators and interns, and many of us who speak Spanish take a last read before it goes on the wall. And then it goes and gets installed, and we do a lot of review on the floor. That week that an exhibition opens, Viri and I are running around the floor, making sure that the vinyl accents are included, that no letters were dropped, that commas are present. And that is an integral part of the process. And I'm going to let Viri tell a little bit about how AI has come to be part of this work.
So we stay here because also I want to add something that I heard from previous lecturers mentioning that slow down when you're translating a text. And it's true, but in the sense that sometimes translating something is more close to creative writing instead of like just making semantics or just making sure everything is correct in the language that they're working on. So when you read a book or when you read a label that we need, and it has like a word at minimum for 5-6 persons. And this is not because just one person is enough to just do the whole process of like translating, reviewing, and making sure that everything makes sense. It's also the power of the institution of like being just reviewing in this language. So sometimes the people don't know about what we posted in the walls is just deeply review it and discuss. And sometimes we have like long chains of emails talking about one word, one term, or even the translation of a city. So here I'm going to just share like probably one of the first examples that create this conversation. We have here an artwork by Mary Beth Edison, and the name in English of this art piece was Shellmans. So if we just translate, we just made this kind of example with AI, the ChatGPT, DeepL, and a human translator. And the proposals that we received for this art piece, it was Concha de Venus, Venus Marina. So for those who don't get it, this is more close to a sexualized meaning. So we were having a deep joke there, and we were just exploring what are the possibilities, what are the chances that we can get caught in this exercise of like just being humans and getting them beyond that the literal meaning with these words. So in Latin speakers like Mexicans, we all love this kind of play with these words. So this is one of the first examples that we have. We have another one. Oh, we're going really fast here. So as you know, probably Romance languages have somebody mentioned here are genderized. So in Spanish, we have this issue of being inclusive, but we find like ways to just also allow people or people who is not identified as female or male just be included in a text. So that is happening also in Spanish, and we have a deep conversation in the last 2 biennials about respecting the pronouns, even when an artist is referred by itself by non-binary. So this is at the beginning, it was very complicated, but then when we got used to it, got easier to just make the text match and not even add ease at the end of substantives or certain words. So here is another example that we have an issue of this art piece that it was named in French. And excuse my pronunciation, I don't know French, but it's tête d'homme. So it was translated into Spanish as cabeza humana or cabeza de hombre. And we went through the most inclusive word, that is cabeza humana, that includes female and male or whatever wants to be included there. So it's one of the statements that we are doing in the last 2 biennials, where we make sure that even the text for a certain artist who is not identified as a man or a woman gets there. Or even when our like groups of LGBT+, excuse me, in Spanish, and my Spanish is here right now. So we make sure that the vocabulary is appropriate to just be part of the narrative. And I just want to add this part of the anecdote here that it was happening in the last months. I don't know if you heard, but if you don't, let's make fun of this because I love so much Bad Bunny. And if you already know this, I just want to just remind the power of like the popular culture. We sometimes the academy thinks that they are creating. So the academy is just naming us like Latino, Latina, Latinx, but sometimes we don't care how the academy is naming us with an ethnicity. And I just want to point out that Bad Bunny in October 2025 announced that he will just be doing the halftime show with the Super Bowl. And in one night, in a night show, he was saying, no es logro mío, sino de todos, nuestra aportación a este país, nadie la podrá borrar. And if you didn't understand what I just said, you must learn Spanish, or you have 4 months to learn Spanish. This moment went viral, and by February, Duolingo reported 35% increase in users learning Spanish. The same winner in this year, you already know what happened. So detentions and deportations rose sharply. On January 7, Renee McLean, a 37-year-old woman, was killed by ICE during an operation. The message for many communities received was clear. The risk was real. No one felt entirely safe. Some of my coworkers began photocopying their children's passports to be able to prove their US citizenship. And also, Bad Bunny deleted his Instagram account. So Spanish then exists in a dual condition, has a side of cultural affirmation and has a space of vulnerability in this point. And I just want to go super fast here and reframe the geography or the Whitney Museum. Right now, we are in Lower Manhattan in 99 Gainsborough. You are welcome to come and see. But the neighborhood has a very historic relationship with the Hispanic community. In Chelsea Market, we have the first church that it was founded by Spanish people coming to US in the early 1900s. So here we have a few pictures taken at the beginning of the century, and then here 2010, and then 2020. Here is the La Iglesia de Guadalupe. It was started as a small church, and then was transferred in the location that we already know in 14th Street, that is in San Bernard. So, and in this community that is super close to the museum, we have to be reminded the geography is also important. Now, probably the Hispanic community is not all around nearby the museum, but we have to look for those audiences. And sometimes communities like mine, like Mexican, are not feeling welcome to come to the museums, not even the Whitney, not even the Met, not even the MoMA. So how we work with those communities, because it's not enough to have walls translated into Spanish. It also requires a lot of work that is not just about text. Here, I just want to add these photos that are referenced that within part of the city. So here it is in Inwood, a barber shop. Here we have the first Puerto Rican educator put up a bread in the New York Public Library, has an educator just reading notebooks, books for children. And we have the Hispanic Society, La Nacional, that is nearby to the Whitney in 14th Street. So beyond buildings and organizations, what sustain these communities are people, their need for representations, their celebrations, their food, their music, dance and rituals. Language is just invisible threads that connect us all. And here, as I mentioned before, we just not are translating text, it's just working with communities that also have Spanish speakers. We, every year, at least 3, 4, 5 programs are showing in the museum with communities that bring plays, that bring celebrations to the museum and bring their own community. It's a way of building audiences, not just bragging one program. It's also just a work during whole years around thinking about just representing those communities. When a person is part of a group of theaters or theater players, they bring their family to know the museum. Sometimes they are first coming to the Whitney through these programs. And here I just want to mention a couple of these communities. Just yesterday we were talking to the director of Feria Internacional del Libro in New York City, and we also have Friday nights where the New York Public Library have like their people sending their educators to read books. And we have a lot here. We don't do everything because the education department at the Whitney is a big team who works in different areas. And in my case, I work with text and translated all the documents. And Cris is the leader who coordinates the whole department. I don't know how you can do that. But thank you. I hope I didn't go over so fast.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a very specific question. So I know that you say you talk to Spanish-speaking artists whose work you're exhibiting in the museum and you consult them on the translations, but what about artists who aren't Spanish-speaking? Is the understanding that you present their artwork at the museum and you have liberty to translate it as you see fit, or do you consult them in any way?
So we consult every artist, even those that are non-Spanish speakers. Everybody gets an artist agreement, and in that artist agreement, we state that the museum will be translating their work and that we would engage in conversation. Because some artists speak other languages, and we want to make sure that those translations into Spanish and into English are accurate. So it is a broad conversation. And in 2 recent exhibitions, we had artists who's had an indigenous language, and we have translated English, Spanish, and into their spoken indigenous language to extend that exercise. We have not on the walls translated into other languages, French or Asian or Italian. Most of it gets done on our Bloomberg Connects app. While not perfect, Bloomberg relies heavily on Google Translate. That translates to 136 languages. We will edit the Spanish version ourselves as a team. So it is a concerted effort of making labels and exhibition content as broadly translated as possible. But yes, it is a conversation with artists and curators.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else has questions, comments? Yes.
Do you use language service providers at all, as in agencies, for the other languages, if you were to deal with them?
We haven't for other language other than Spanish.
That's right, yeah.
We in the case of indigenous languages, we do work with an external agency. We do not necessarily work with we don't do it ourselves, or we don't let AI translate it. If it's going on our wall, it's going through a professional translator with that translator.
So you contract individual actual translators instead of going to language service providers, as in those big corporations.
Yeah.
So okay, so hear that, guys.
Can I have
Reach out.
Yes, and we mainly hire people, and I think that is the main goal of like a living artist museum. So yes, in certain cases, like with live translation, we just get through collectives. But for text, I think it's good to just hire individuals, not like businesses, because they are a lot and they pay so little to their subcontractors. So in every exhibition, depending what is the style of, like when existed, it was a Puerto Rican exhibition. We hired like every translator was Puerto Rican. Obviously the proofreaders and everyone, because it needs to be accurate. I am Mexican, but I know in Puerto Rico their Spanish is a little different, so they have certain words that don't have the meaning for the rest of Latin American. So I think it's good to think about people.
Right, and I trust you will continue to reach out to me.
Yes.
And we can work together and have students.
Oh yes, and we have last year some.
Exactly, convenient.
Yes, we send like emails to just recruit some interns during the spring and the fall for Spanish.
Okay, I see that we have 2 questions on Zoom from Laura. She says, how do you choose your translators? That's the first question. And then second, this is in reference to tête d'homme. What if the artist did not want to be inclusive, or is this the museum's policy across the board?
I'll take the second question, and then you can answer the question about, which was a little bit of what you just said about translators. But in that artist agreement, we also sent out a survey for artists to self-identify. They can tell us as much or as little as they want. And many, many artists today will tell us their self-identification, their preferred pronouns, their country of origin, their preferred language. And we use that to start a conversation. And that is what defines how we will represent that artist. So I hope that answers that question, but I'm going to let you answer how we hire our translator.
So we have a request for proposals, and we started like just honoring like careers. If a translator has a deep background in translating books or working in different areas of the art world, just in Spanish, we respect and we see what are our limits in budgets. But usually, yeah, it's a process of like requesting their quotes and seeing if we can pay them, and also checking their background. And it's just bureaucratic, but it's important because we know in that way we know how we are going to work with every individual. So the Whitney is just very competitive in every area of like across departments, not just in our department, in every department. So we have to follow the protocols of like, yes, here it is the request, and here it is the process. Could you send me a proof of your text and the English and Spanish, and making sure that those steps are met. It give me a sense how people work and how people behave and how they communicate. It's not just looking the best, or they hired the person who has more degrees. It's also working with people who can just work for us and can get ways of communicating, or just people, being people. Was there another question on Zoom, or is those both more?
So this is from Alejandra. She says, how about volunteering? Can you give information about that? Wonderful presentation.
Thank you. We welcome a lot of volunteers. We have a docent program that has about 45 docents, some of which have been volunteer for the Whitney for over 40 years. We this winter started a new cohort welcoming 18 docents, of which 5 of them speak another language other than English, with the intention of them giving tours in their native language. So that is another way in which we are continue to work with other languages. We are very interested in expanding our volunteer pool of Spanish speakers, because that is where the higher demand is. The second, in terms of visitors self-identification, Spanish is the highest at 15%, French and Italian at 7%, and Asian and South Asian languages at 3%. So this is why we're first starting with Spanish.
Thank you so much. Just before we go to the conclusion, any last comments, questions? We're all good? All right, well, thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause, please.
So before I forget, big shout of thanks to our Translation and Interpreting Society of Hunter student leaders. We have Joanna here. I think some of them have gone to class, and of course Noah, and of course none other than our, couldn't have done any of this without our program admin, Danella. One of these days when we have more time, we should make her sing. That's the secret, she's a great singer. But anyway, we've done a lot of listening. So here's the time for you guys to speak, right? I will start by saying, just, by way of wrapping up the little bit that we rushed through, Sebastian and myself, and also actually occurred to me throughout this today's work of the speakers. I think the running theme, right? The running theme for us, well, there's several, but I think one is that for us to go forward at this point, right? We want to go back to language specific. We want to anchor languages in specific cultures as well. And while we can go into, you know, the usual media rhetoric of diversity and multilingualism and all that, in some ways, I think, you know, the presenters have touched on that in one way or another, that can be a weapon against human translation as well, right? That can be there's a flattening effect, you know, in our banalizing multilingualism, right? In fact, we really, if you genuinely want to kind of engage with what translation and what reading is really about in the meaningful sense of it, then you cannot get away with community, with actual neighborhoods, with that actual play, you know, the actual pulsating moment of whatever it is that's being performed on stage, or somebody's medical crisis, right? Actual people, you know, that you have to look in the eye. And so then content then leaps out of the flatness of things, right? That, you know, content becomes distinct at every moment. And that's what's going to keep us alive, right? I think we are not I think we're not the least of, like I said, of the worries, right? The worries are people that take for granted, that are monolingual, that are, you know, this one story for everybody else, because that's how they see things, right? And then if we're going to translate to be just purely target oriented, that's what's going to happen, right? Anyway, okay, enough of that. So on that happy note, who wants to start? We have the other microphone. Where's the other microphone? Yeah, if you could introduce, because I think it's nice for us to all know this community, right? That we've spent the day together. Introduce yourself and then go on.
Kaplan, among other things, an interpreter. I don't know how you.
What's on? It's on already. Just listen.
Yes, it's okay. You hear?
Yes, go ahead.
I have such a loud voice anyway. A comment I wanted to make for several of the. We talk AI. AI is technology. Language is culture. Since I operate on a daily basis in at least 3 languages, there are words that you cannot even translate. Try to translate Yiddish into English. Yiddish is a patois, it's not a language. And there is an expression in Yiddish, don't mix my head, Dreimonisch can cope. You can translate it, don't shake my head. It isn't. The AI cannot do it. And yes, AI can do something, it's a tool. But another thing, the Bible, as somebody who learned the Bible for 12 years, they shove it down our throat. The Bible, there are words in the Bible that to this day they don't know what it means. How do you expect the AI to know it? Not to mention it, the Bible is 2,000 years old. Deeper, somebody was talking about Macbeth. When Shakespeare wrote it, the world was different. Shakespeare didn't know anything about television, about a telephone, about trains. I don't want to mention so many things. When he refers to something completely different than what the.
This sounds familiar. I believe we talked about this last year as well. But yeah, we get your point. Yes. So
I'm having a huge problem with this relationship to the AI. AI can be a tool, but not.
Yes, but we need to pay attention because it's the tool that actually caused some people to kill themselves. So wait. Okay, who? Let's get somebody from Zoom first. Go ahead. I think I didn't have my glasses. You gotta help me.
Miktian, you could turn on your mic and say something.
Hello, everybody. My question was instigated by the talk from Carolyn Shread or Shread. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it's still a little bit inchoate. I wrote some notes. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read like 2 itty-bitty paragraphs. So I loved your sample assignment, but it made me realize that I probably could not apply it directly in my course at BMCC. I teach at a community college. Because it presupposes a kind of prior formation that many of my students lack for 1,000 different reasons. So they have strong English and Spanish skills, but they are still developing stylistic judgment and metacognitive reflection. So the ability to recognize differences in tone and register rhythm, why things change, why they're good, why they're bad. And I have not integrated AI into my assignments because I am a little bit of a techno pessimist, but I have noticed that they use AI. And so when they use AI in translation or in their analysis of their own choices, the work is usually flattened. It's just all the same. And this is an asynchronous course, so we communicate through email. And when I do ask them, they don't have the tools to notice that that's happening, like when I bring it up. And so I'm curious whether anyone has ideas for bridging that gap, whether with AI exercises or without, of how do we build the judgment students need in order to use AI critically, or even the desire and I mean, it's still inchoate in my mind. Like I said, I'm not exactly sure about my question, but there's a ginormous gap there. Anyway, that's my more or less formless question.
Choose here, yeah, and anybody really.
Yeah.
Okay, Giulia. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay.
Probably this is not an answer, but it's myself using AI like an addiction. And I feel that probably you already talked about this before with somebody else, but AI, yes, is a tool, and we as human has the power to bring that AI tool to the limit. Let me explain one of my situations because I use it for like mental health, for translation, for care, for like looking for information about DMV, IRS, in trading, etc. So I use AI like for everything in my life, and I love it. I love it, and it can be really kind, but also it can be really rough if you want. If you make a question there, the AI can respond you really rude. So yes, the point is explore the AI has in its limit because it's made by humans. It's made by us, and we have to explore it the most that we can and see what is their limit because it has a limit. Sometimes in certain periods, you make questions and give me approach about indigenous something, and they don't have the information. Or bring me an approach about feminism in blah blah blah, and they don't have information. Then the next 2 days they have the response for the same question. So I think AI can be scary, but also can be, yes, if we use it to the limit and be conscientious that it's not a person and make it clear with the new generations, because probably I am the generation that grew up with internet and we were in that transition of technology, and we were the first generation exploring all those possibilities with internet. And the generation that right now is growing up, it's just was born with internet, and they don't have that barrier or that border to differentiating like how was life without technology then and how is just living with technology now. So probably this is not a response, but I think the AI is amazing. But somebody in the back. Definitely, it has to be bring to the limit.
Sorry, if we could limit so that everybody, because I want to hear as many voices. And
I work in a community college. I work at Bronx Community College, so we are sisters in that way. She works at a four-year college, a sort of a very important four-year college, and our students are very, very different, as we know, right? Demographics does matter. I want to go through the students' demographic at CUNY, but so I'm not. So my concrete example would be something that I do. For example, I would start small. Put a sentence. I don't know. What language you teach? Spanish or French? I didn't hear, but whatever. Let's write a sentence. Let's say in Spanish or a way of saying it, and then in class say, okay, how would you translate this in English? It's such a like, for example, break a leg. In English, a particular sentence, and then ask the students in class how would they translate it into another language, into a language they know, or if the majority of students happen to be Spanish, and on the board write these translations and have them talk about it, but very small. So, and then maybe in class have them translate maybe 3 sentences in their own native language, and then talk about just maybe a tone. You can also show how that starting from just really small examples. Maybe they come out the whole semester. Maybe they know that you teach them what tone is, or and they learn the difference between translation by AI, translations by human, and the differences. And I think that would be a great learning experience. You don't have to go into what they do at Columbia or Harvard, but I think you can still they can still come out of your class and teach to the students you have, not the one you wish you had, but the reality of our students. Otherwise, we lose them. We lose them because I don't think they know what you're talking about. So I would really try to break down the learning into small sections. That's how at least I would do it.
Thank you. I think that's a great idea. And I think probably the biggest weakness of my course is the fact that it's all asynchronous. And so
yes, I was going to say that. I mean,
yeah.
The first of all, the root of the evil lies in the synchronous mode. I've taught synchronous myself, right? Because it becomes, and again, back to the theme that we have today, it becomes so product focused. That this is an assignment, and the student's job is to produce something for you, right? So that you lose the dynamism, and the interactive of that process, and getting the student, getting the juices out, right? The enjoyment, of going of wordplay, right? So I think, yeah, getting that back would help.
Thanks so much for this thoughtful question. I think that AI has produced a crisis of confidence that's also an opportunity. It's the student's confidence in themselves. And there's nothing more heartbreaking than receiving something written by AI. I don't care about it. I don't care about it at all. And I told that to a student who handed something to me. I said, what I care about is you as a person. And this is for every student in every different college. The most important thing is communicating that care, and that what the human meaning is coming out of whatever they might be able to what they bring to it. They are what's valuable in the process. And so I do think that critical reflection starts from an expression of care. And I think that critical thinking cannot exist if there's no confidence in the ability of any person who's learning to do that learning.
Yeah. Okay, who wants to pick up something, could be on another topic, go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick.
It's short so everybody gets it.
Yes, so I'm interested in a theme that's come up today around AI as technology. and wondering about the degree to which translation interpretation is of a different order from other functions that take people's jobs. So like driving. I like to think those together would be interesting. On the one hand, this work is interpretive and cultural and aesthetic, and there are all these various, like what it means to do it. Perhaps it's a different type of object. But I guess I am very taken by a recent take on AI that has been trying to think about it as a social history through a Marxist lens and tracing it to the 19th century and industrialization, and actually arguing algorithms and the models for AI actually go there. And so what you see is it's a question of labor and capital. And thinking of it that way, I think creates a different landscape for what type of workers in what situations should be replaceable and not replaceable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's, I think it calls for a political economy framework to really understand what's going on and how it is that, here we are, you're practically the entire planet has devoted, the humongous, the bulk of the world's resources toward producing something that is controlled by a handful of people. That's how horrific it is, right? And then if we keep going at this rate, and like I said, at the expense of such environmental destruction, not to mention, destruction of humanity. So yeah, it's very very heavy.
Actually, I wanted to respond to McKenna a little bit. I think like I have like a very, not as an educator, of course, but I have like a passing familiarity for the types of students you're dealing with. It's like I know a couple. I think I know some people like that. And what I've noticed is that, as you said, they already have this competency in English and Spanish. And my guess is just because of how they've grown up and how they've gotten language education, if they've gotten it, they haven't been made aware of the fact that they actually do have these skills. They sort of have not like fully developed skills, but they at the very least, they have the potential for it already. And it hasn't really been, maybe it hasn't been like observed or nurtured or cultivated. So I don't have like a direct answer, but it could also be a matter of like making them aware that they already have this knowledge, even if they aren't consciously aware of it all the time.
We're not spoken. Go ahead. Any thoughts at all, right? Doesn't have to follow the same track. Or burning the safe. Joanna.
I just want to I guess like piggyback off of the comment of I guess like labor like and seeing AI like as a tool, like as opposed to like in and of itself like actually like doing the labor. And I forgot, like I had in one of the presentations, like I think I believe it was Olivia, like I had as a conclusion AI lacks lived experience. And I remember thinking like that's really powerful, because I think that's part of the difference like between thinking of AI like and thinking of like us human beings like that use language, in that AI, I myself think like ontologically, but like maybe like at some point like it might, like I don't know, like AI doesn't have the capacity like to even have lived experience. Like it can't experience the world like in the same way that we do. And in fact, like large language models now, the way that they work is that they quote unquote learn from what we put out, as opposed to like actually experiencing like the full context like of language as it's being used. So they're great tools because they can give you like a lot of options. Like, but I believe like someone had mentioned like that in the end, like you're the one that is making the decision on what to use. And then also it's still like really weird to think about like what exactly it is like that humans have like that, like what we do like can be considered labor, as opposed to like the thing like that gives value to what we produce, like as opposed to like what the machines are doing. But it's definitely clear like that since we are the ones like making the decision, like we are the ones that are creating that labor and the ones that experience the world, like, and not the AI itself. So there's still a lot like to tease out of that, like, but it's just I feel like this whole conference has been very fruitful, like, and there are many things like that can be said like in either way.
I guess a thought that I had is related to what you shared, Carolyn. So I was recently reading about like Mexican history, and when the missionaries arrived and started with one of the goals of spreading like scripture with Nahuatl populations that didn't speak Spanish, for instance. One thing the historian was describing in this book was that the most effective way that the missionaries found to spread religion in this case was theater. And because it was something that was transmitted by way of like performance, which I think kind of links your two talks in a way. But also I found it fascinating because one of the points you made in your talk was about, hey, like you kind of got to get in the weeds of something that requires memory practice. And like one thing that the historian mentions in that exchange of knowledge was that for the Nahuatl people that were a primarily oral history, oral storytelling like culture, for them to learn the plays that the missionaries were sharing with them was like nothing. Like and when those missionaries sent letters to the crown, they were like, the people that we're converting here are learning plays in weeks. That takes like peninsulares, like people in the Iberian Peninsula, like years to memorize. So I just thought I'd share that anecdote as far as like, so we've done this before in our like shared human history, and I think it's fascinating to see those points of like culture connect.
Someone else? Oh, Joanne, okay. Yeah, just to add with when it comes to teaching using AI, just like as an educator myself, I just kind of wanted to comment a few things. So when I am teaching, when it's not just translation wise, just when it comes to teaching languages in general, yeah, using AI can be beneficial, especially with like, you know, coming up with lesson plan and everything like that. But personally, when it comes to teaching, I feel like it is your motif that is like the basis of teaching instead of just like the AI basis itself. Because I feel like when it comes to teaching, you definitely need a human touch. You definitely need to understand what your students are feeling when it comes to, you know, facing difficulties when with learning a different language. And my target audience for me as an educator, I teach senior citizens. So a lot of senior citizens, they don't know anything about AI. First of all, they don't know a lot of things about technology. So knowing that, you know, they're, you know, technologically challenged, and yet like, you know, if you want to kind of have them be connected through like a modern time and like kind of bridge the generational gap together. I don't think AI is really necessary when it comes to teaching, because I feel like you need to personally understand how each students are feeling when it comes to, you know, where they're at when it comes to like, you know, their level of understanding. So yes, it is definitely helpful, but at the same time, it just seems like you need to have like the as someone who, especially with the senior citizens, how they speak in dialects instead of the standardized Korean, for example. So you kind of have to like understand, you know, even if you use AI to kind of translate what the dialects mean, they're not always correct. So when you're trying to understand what your students are saying, I feel like you kind of need to like have an actual like personal understanding of where everyone is. So I don't think really, I personally am not really for AI, just personally for me when it comes to teaching, but that's just my, you know, my few cents of thoughts. So yeah.
Thank you for. Yeah.
Thank you. I also teach at a CUNY school at Baruch, where probably every student in my class speaks a different language as their first language. And one of the first things we do in my class is that we acknowledge that we're using AI. Many of them, because English is not their first language, they're writing in their own language and then using AI for translation, and or for asking questions about what the topics of the class. I teach a class on education and lesson planning. And what we do in the first session is acknowledge that AI will only get better if we ask better questions. We, at 4 years old, asked more than 40,000 questions. By the time we're in college, that number has dropped down by 80%. I want my students to be more inquisitive, have more questions, challenge the technology. And I will recognize they're using it, but how do we get them from, this is the answer that was provided? Are you reflecting on the response? Are you being critical about how you're going to use that response to continue to learn? What is the purpose of getting that information? So I think
it gets back to the question of you're using AI as a tool, as an assistant to your experience, and you remain the center.
Yeah, and that's this open, a really constructive conversation versus semesters where I knew they were using AI, but I did not confront the conversation. And I ended up having students that 5 of them turn in the same paper. And not because they knew that they were turning the same papers, they asked very similar questions to the tool. So we sort of tackled that.
The problem is, I think the problem is the students are really vulnerable.
Yes.
Right. And you have, in the meantime, an actual concerted project of dispossessing human beings, especially the underclass, right, of agency, of the barest intelligence. Yesterday, I actually had somebody, I'm going to share this anecdote if I may, from China, an entrepreneur, successful one, you know, at that. And I was just surprised he was so alienated and so bored. He decided at the age of, I don't know, he's probably close to 50, that he would compose songs. This guy doesn't read music, has not played an instrument in his life. So he has composed 6 songs. He said that he has half an album now. And would I like to listen? And, you know, it's incredible. So, you know, he spent a lot of time using AI to put together an orchestra. And he chose his singer. The only thing that he did was he wrote some of his favorite lyrics. Right? Does that sound familiar to you guys? Right. And so this is the kind of thing, right? Imagine this, of course, I don't care about this. You know, I told him, I said, I don't care about this music. Right? It's all very good. This is it. I didn't want to offend him. But then here's the thing. He has a 10-year-old. Imagine the effect that, you know, a parent like that on a 10-year-old. Right. So, you know, that gets back to, you know, your point about the theater, right? Indeed, right? We get back to like interpreting translation 101 context. You know, your actual relationship, you know, with what your engagement with the text, with the action. That's why it's easy to remember. And I would share another bit of data, right? Very, very short one, which is this, as simple as this. When I ask my informants in my research, right, about the day-to-day work and all that, and I get a lot of this information, some of that, you know, I share with you, right? It's always the logistics, you know, it's always, you know, about, of course, you know, pay and, you know, the economics, right? You know, of their freelance work. But very little, hardly any, you know, that they could remember of the day-to-day content of interpreting. Now, maybe some of you would you know, would object to that and say, I'm making this up. Let me finish, right? The flip side is when I probe to say, okay, what is the most memorable moment in your work? Then the thing that comes out of that would be distinctive content, would be something that goes wrong in the translation of the interpreting process, right? Again, right back to this thing of the aggravation, the frustration, and all of those things that AI is sure to try to, get rid of, and relieve us of, right? So that what we say, we have been on about the art of translation, right? Today, the art of translation, and art is about the critical edge. Art is about unsettling and changing things, being upset and then coming through and being empowered. But then art out in the market world is about entertainment. That's why art and entertainment, come as, almost like a compound, right? Like, oh, what industry are you in? Oh, I'm in art and entertainment. Exactly. It's all sugar. Yeah. Yes, King. Oh, sorry.
Then if you could pass. Hi, I think for me, I just realized that the cancer center I work at, they realized just now that the AI is the least tool that they're going to use right now, because we basically before we didn't have interpreter in the cancer center, we use AI all the time, but they realized the patient were coming in with frustration, complaints, and even stop getting treatments at the cancer center because of the using AI interpreting, because there's no compassion whatsoever. So recently, the cancer center at the medical field I work at, the hospital decided that they would eliminate the AI translation or AI interpreting machine translation, because it's really hard to even deliver any news, good news or bad news, to the patient with just a machine. So we just started launch something like a interaction face-to-face interpreter, hiring more interns, licensed interpreter working at the cancer center to improve, because we've been receiving a lot of complaints about people leaving treatment because they don't feel anything. So they refuse treatments because they don't feel any compassion at the hospital. So now they eliminate that at our hospital right now just for that. And yeah, so we hired some interns and also some interpreter, a licensed interpreter and translator, and starting to and then they also not just hiring them to the interpreter, but also to show compassion too. So you have to be compassionate with what you do, and also have a compassion with the people who are diagnosed with cancer. And so it's so something I learned, that a lot of hospitals are not really pro AI these days because of what's going on.
So here comes the pessimist. Just want to raise a perspective that is often overlooked. The situation of AI right now, I've been observing for a long while, is that the overwhelming majority of people, they are seeing AI as kind of an omnipotent deus ex machina. You throw a whole mountain of work to AI and get a perfect result, and then they get disappointed this way and that. So these people are not our focus here. We are talking about the rest of them who see AI as a useful tool. What happens when you use AI the right way is suddenly you get supercharged. When you can do the work of maybe 20, 50 people. So what happens is the demand
I think what you're saying is in fact, those are the very people, those people who essentialize AI are the very people that are the focus of our conversation here. Isn't that what we're saying?
Not really. Let me continue. So what happens is the total amount of demand in the market is the same. And suddenly we have this small bunch of people who are supercharged. So instead of having 1,000 people to get all the work done, right now we just need maybe 10 to cover everything, and just as well. Then let's think about what AI does well. What AI does is just only essentially recognizing patterns and replicating. So when this happens, jobs are going to be killed. Where does it start? It starts from the most repetitive part. Even in the work of a translator, there are two parts. There are repetitive parts and creative parts. I am speaking from the perspective of a language service provider who relies on this to pay my bills, so I know what I'm talking about. The result is suddenly a lot of new people, they have no chance to get into this sector at all. Sometimes I feel guilty for doing my job, thinking that for every single project I get, somewhere maybe 5 or 10 new graduates, they are robbed of this opportunity.
Right, but sooner or later, I hate to say this, since you want to be a pessimist, you would be cut off too. And you realize
no.
Oh,
I think with the current state of AI, they have no chance of replacing me in maybe 50 years. But that is not the worst part. The worst part is when you're thinking about the whole situation, where it's going. Where it's going is pretty much every single sector will be impacted, and maybe 80% of people in that sector can be made redundant.
Right.
The sectors are still there. They still need humans, just maybe 10% of what they need before. In the end, the difference between this round of industrial revolution and the previous round is that with the invention of steam engines and computers, they killed entire sectors and created new. This time, though, it's quite different because all the sectors are still there. They just don't need those people. So the perspective and I want to raise awareness of is the rise of AI is not really robbing people of jobs. It's enabling some human to rob other humans of jobs.
Exactly. Exactly, which is why this is not just a conversation about translation. It is a conversation about how you have to return to being for the human movement. You've got to actually think seriously about that. And starting with actually, how do you not be dependent so totally? Start one step, small step at a time, totally on the internet. Why is it well, how do we decenter this kind of work that you do, Kane, that I do some of, but I'm lucky because I have a full-time job, you would say that, and you see here in the room, those of us who could talk with real passion and conviction, that about translation are precisely the people that anchor themselves in messy lives, working with little people, as I'm sure Mark Zuckerberg would say, those little people, on the Lower East Side, in Whitney or Losida or Henry Street Settlement, right? Or in a school somewhere, or in Dinah's hospital. Right? Here's the thing, right? We have to wean ourselves off the infatuation of being the neoliberal freelancer. Yes, I'm saying it right now, right? I'm saying it right now here at Hunter College. That is the term. That is what we all need to participate in, which is decenter the freelance model. I know it's comfortable. My best friend, she couldn't get out of it, even though she's crying every day. She asked to only work at home, right? So she makes probably more money than most people. But at the end of the day, if you're going to lose touch with everything, I'd rather make much less, right? Currently, to be honest with you, right, I don't know if this is going to get me in trouble, but maybe then now you'll be on my side, right? I am playing music on a folk instrument, and I've always been doing that, but I more consciously do it at least 10 to 12 hours a week. Okay, that's a big percentage of my time. And why do I do that? Because I am selfish for myself. Because that's how, you remain in touch with material culture, with the material world. You're not as freaked out, and obsessed with what AI can do. I'm not interested in what AI can do.
I have the same crisis with the internet, like 30 or 40 years when the internet was going to be. All the jobs are going to get lost with the internet. Remember, we had telephone operator, we had...
yeah, but it's on a scale that's quite different, as Kane has just said. Anyway, yeah, let's others who want to jump in here, yes.
Well, I just... I don't personally use AI for my work just because I don't enjoy it, and I am currently able to make enough of a living without it. But I am curious, for people who do engage with it, how high a likelihood is there that in the future, as more and more content available for AI to consume is produced by AI, does it start to cannibalize itself into utter meaninglessness? I mean, if you look at boosting the randomization on AI, it produces absolutely insane sentences, and I don't generate them personally, but I have edited some AI articles, and I'm replacing 90% of the text because it is very good at approximating logical speech, but then I read it and I think, you haven't said anything. So I'm curious where meaning eventually is completely lost from AI content based on AI content in a weird mirroring sequence, like when you accidentally share your screen with the Zoom still open,
Yeah. No, sorry. Sorry.
You go first.
I just want to make a comment, again, not related, but I participated recently at a conference that somebody posted a study that if you take your article that you wrote 20 years ago, as we all have, and throw it in AI, it will show up that 70% was plagiarized by AI already, because it's all the stuff that I placed on myself on my scholarship that's online. It's already took it. So this is a dangerous, again, even if you wrote 20 years ago, that's, for example.
I did that to myself recently. It was horrific. It was horrific. Yes, I put a sentence in to see who else is said the mistake, and then I saw myself. It was horrible. That's all I love.
No, I just wanted to directly address that particular use of AI, because so I use it a lot for stuff that's very formulaic. I do some legal translation, I do affidavits, in documentary evidence, and for things that keep coming on, particular phrases used in those documents that, and it'll remember, it's really good at that. But then once you start getting into more creative things, let's say I have to sometimes translate affidavits so that the person has it, or sometimes to submit as evidence if a particular case goes to trial. And I remember very specifically a particular phrasing that I had to translate that I don't think AI would ever get, just because you have to be really creative, and it involved a negotiation in which someone, I forgot who the person was in the negotiation, started insulting the other side's lawyer, and for those that know Spanish, it was something along the lines of y el cabrón ese al puerco ese le va a llegar lo suyo. And I remember thinking, I need to start thinking about different ways of going about that, because there's no one particular word that I can use for the one that everyone understood, so I need to go around that, I need to be a little bit more creative. So I think because of the fact that to go again from the phrasing that I really like, because AI doesn't have a lived experience, I don't think it could get to that level of creativity. I don't think it could produce something, something that would equal, I guess, the meaning and the force behind such a comment, because you have to express the anger in that as well.
It will.
In that sense, it was more
So in that sense, like I figured like that I didn't have a specific word like for puerco in that particular sense. So anyone that's Puerto Rican out there like will know like that has a lot of strength behind it. So I translated it to like that particular lawyer like is fucking disgusting and he's gonna get his.
All right, any comments?
No, the people who haven't spoken. Yes.
I just want to share, this is a little bit of an epiphany that I had. It's a little bit of a departure, but just while we're talking about AI, I use AI for professional reasons, personal reasons, just bounce ideas off. And I found that the way I like to use it is I like to formulate a really well thought out question before pressing enter. And I discovered that I often learned more about the subject I wanted to learn about from the question I was asking. Cris brought this up when she was talking about the question. And I think Olivia was just saying, like, is there a point where it cannibalizes itself and it just spits out blah and it's already happening? And a lot of the answers I get I discard a lot of it, but I learn more about the question. I learn more about myself or about what I am looking for from the way I phrase my question. And the epiphany was, oh, shoot, this is what people go see clairvoyance about.
Horoscopes. I think this isn't about somebody telling you an essential truth. Your reaction to it, and I'm not
is what's important.
But it's telling you something about how you feel.
Exactly. And I look back at my question and I actually find more value in the way I asked the question. Oh, I already know the answer based on my question. The answer's got some stuff in it, and because it's just like a Google search. But the question is really informing me more. And it was because I'm pretending this is an omnipotent, omniscient being, and I can bequeath a question on it, and I have to be totally candid to get the right answer. So it's kind of a departure from what we're talking about, but it's just some insight and epiphany that I've had with AI.
But the way it relates is that human input will always be vital to it.
Yes,
People
that's
seem
right.
to think that it's going to be this autonomous thing. But at the end of the day, the way that AI responds to you has been programmed into it by a person who started this chain. The way that it is responding is based on a prompt that you, a human, have entered. And if you have AI converse with itself, I really recommend the podcast Shell Game. If you haven't listened to it, it is about the second season, a company that is built and run entirely by AIs as a sort of experiment. They keep saying like, great, I'll get that document to you. Okay, we'll see that document later in a cycle forever and ever, but nothing ever actually gets done. And so once you remove the human from the situation, it is really just an echo chamber, and one that I think is relatively devoid of meaning.
Speaking of that kind of office talk, certainly it's already happening. And here's full disclaimer, right? I use AI specifically for all of this nonsense dealing with the college bureaucracy. You know, write this, write that, you know, do another one for, you know, okay, fine. All right. So, and it's very easy to find out because, you know, how many thousands, tens of thousands, and what millions of people have asked questions like, you know, write this, you know, what is the template for such and such? Oh, do you know what is the impact of, you know, this assessment on this, blah, blah, blah. And it's so easy. Boom, 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 boom. It gives you the entire framework and you just have to fill in the, you know, the specifics. So it really, I'm very thankful for that because then it leaves me with more time for music. Anyway, so guys, listen, it's been great. Oh, somebody, who wants?
Yes, I just want to close. I want to close that idea about AI being built by people, graffiti by people, and also just check the policies. If you have like an AI ChatGPT account, if you check the privacy policies, and if you're making a questions, I just read an area that I was scared about, like health, mental issues, and I was like, let's see what is going on with this information that is very personal. And then I read that the developers, people really sometimes choose like a small group amount of users, and they read what you are like asking. So it's going back to, okay, AI is not just a machine. It's built by people and it's reviewed by people.
Of course.
So delete everything. So I started deleting everything.
You see, an AI, you know, in terms of the filtering, they're not interested in the prisoners that Sebastian was going on about, right? You know, so.
All right. Well, I guess that's a wrap. Thank you so much, everyone. Yes, I am going to ask the presenters actually before you all leave, so we can take a group picture with the banner. And then there's food. So
yes, please. Actually, we can all take a picture, you know, but yeah, presenters first, and then please take some food with you as you leave, okay? And at least get a piece of sandwich because you know all these leftovers.
And thank you everyone who was here on Zoom. Have a great day. Thank you so much for being here, guys. Bye.